My husband keeps bothering me about chores and work, and it's really getting on my nerves. Whenever I ask for something, he says mean things to me. I just wanted us to go through life together happily as a married couple. But if things stay like this, what's the point of being married? Just when I felt like there was no hope, my husband's behavior suddenly changed. I started to think maybe we could finally have the perfect married life I've always wanted. But I was wrong. I shouldn't have believed him. My name is Michelle Taylor, and I'm 43 years old. I met Edward a few years ago while he was on a business trip, and now we live together. We used to have a long-distance relationship where we had to fly to see each other because we were both so busy with work. But after dating for a few years, we finally got married. I'm going to make you happy for the rest of our lives, Edward said when he proposed to me. I never thought I could marry such a wonderful man. Back then, he was really friendly, and it seemed like a lot of women liked him. It might sound weird, but I felt really lucky that he chose me. Because of the distance, I moved to where he lived, and we started our life together as a married couple. But I couldn't just quit my job, so I found another company to work for. Why? Well, because Edward wasn't earning enough. Either his company didn't pay well, or he hadn't been promoted. I wasn't sure, but his salary was definitely too low. If I stopped working, we wouldn't have enough money to live on. At first, Edward wanted me to stay at home. But as we faced reality, he stopped talking about it. Even now, years later, it's the same. We both worked hard to make ends meet. But then something happened that changed everything. It was because of Edward's actions. He was really nice when we first got married. But as time went on, he started showing his true colors. It started with little things. Like, he wouldn't clean up after eating. Hey, can you clear the table when you're done? Oh yeah, sorry. He'd do it when I asked, but then he'd forget again a few days later. Can you take care of the dishes? Oh yeah. We had talked about sharing household chores before we got married, but once we were married, Edward hardly did any chores. He always had an excuse. I thought maybe he was just tired, so I didn't bug him about it. But if I'm honest, Edward finished work earlier than me, and it seemed like he had it pretty easy. He even said his job was easy. Meanwhile, my job was demanding and kept me busy almost every day. Dealing with Edward and managing work along with household chores was really tough. Couldn't he pitch in a bit? I reached my limit and decided to talk seriously with Edward. Hey, about the chores, could you maybe help out a bit more? I'm really exhausted. Suddenly, Edward's expression changed. You could see right away that he was annoyed. I get it, he said, his voice full of anger. Although I didn't bring it up then, I couldn't help but wonder why he was so defensive. After that day, Edward's behavior changed a lot. I knew why. I had asked him to help with the chores. Thinking about it now, maybe Edward just sees me as a convenient maid. One day, after finishing work as usual, I came home to the smell of alcohol in the air. Holding back my disgust, I went to the living room. When I opened the door, I found Edward lying on the couch surrounded by empty beer cans. I figured he probably didn't go to work. Hey, what's going on? Are you alright? I asked, approaching my seemingly drunk husband. But Edward, opening his shut eyes, glared at me. Ah, so annoying, he grumbled. Annoying? His response was clearly disdainful, and he shut his eyes again. But seeing him so lost in alcohol, I started to worry. Did he have a breakdown without me noticing? Did he turn to alcohol to escape? Hey, what's with all the alcohol? I asked. Edward snapped. I told you it's none of your business. Before I could say more, he got up and started yelling at me, slurring his words. He threw insults and stormed off to his room. I was just trying to show concern. Why was I being treated like this? Alone in the living room, I cleaned up the beer cans and snack wrappers Edward left behind. Then one day, laundry and dishes were scattered around, some broken, including my favorites. Given what happened, I knew Edward did it on purpose. I wanted to confront him, but he wasn't home, though he should have been done with work. Maybe he was out drinking. He trashed the place and left. It's so mean. I called Edward, but he didn't answer. I texted, and he replied quickly. I'm not coming home tonight. No explanation. What should I do? Should I just go along with Edward's behavior? Is this my fault? It feels hopeless. I thought I did the right thing. What could I have done differently? Lost in thought, I cleaned up the mess. Later, I noticed a scratch on the floor, a reminder of this day. The next day, as he promised, Edward came back, smelling of alcohol and unsteady on his feet. What were you doing? I was really worried, I said, frustrated that he didn't even greet me. What I do is none of your business, he replied. We're married, so of course it's my business. His attitude made me even more annoyed. Pressing him further, Edward gave me an irritated look and went to his room without a word. Oh dear, a sigh escaped me involuntarily. Did I really marry someone with such a difficult personality? Where did I go wrong? Tears started flowing as I thought about it. But I wasn't giving up. If I'm patient and keep facing my husband, maybe one day he'll understand how I feel. He might spend weekends with me or even help with chores. I'm not asking for much. Right now, I just want him to be in a good mood. With that hope, I tried to talk to Edward. How was work today? Tough day. Dinner tonight is meat and potatoes. But he didn't respond well. Ignoring me became routine. He'd click his tongue and give annoyed looks. Fixing our marriage seemed impossible with Edward acting like this. Lately, he wouldn't even touch the meals I made. Eventually, I started to rethink our relationship. Should we stay married like this? Would it be better to leave him alone? The more I thought, the more negative I became. I made one last plea to Edward. Please don't ignore me when I talk to you. Surprisingly, he seemed to understand and apologize. I'm sorry. I was surprised. I never expected him to apologize. Then he said, I'll help with the housework from now on. Really? Yeah, I've been thoughtless until now, he said, gently patting my head. It felt like it had been years. It seemed suspicious, considering his past behavior. It's natural to be skeptical, but I wanted to believe Edward had changed for the better, and I let myself hope. Afterward, he truly started helping around the house. Laundry, cooking, cleaning, sometimes everything was done before I got home. I never knew Edward could cook. Sitting down in front of my beaming husband, we shared meals together. He also put more effort into his job. He used to avoid overtime, but now he mentioned studying for certifications and often stayed late. How's work going lately? I asked. It's going well, Edward replied with a smile. Our time together increased, feeling like the honeymoon phase again. But one thing bothered me. Despite claiming overtime, there was no extra pay. Since Edward never did overtime before, it was puzzling. Aren't you getting paid for overtime? I asked. He said, Oh, it's for independent study. I did request overtime pay. Oh, really? I'd like him to claim it for the extra money, but I'm not familiar with his company's policies. For now, I decided to trust Edward's decision. However, I would later regret fully accepting his changes. One day, my business trip was confirmed. I would be away from home for work. Before, my business trips were shorter, but this time it's for a whole week. Excitement, anxiety, and loneliness all grew within me. When I told Bob about the trip, his reaction surprised me. A business trip? How many days? Usually he's not very interested when I mention business trips and never asks how long I'll be away. But this time, he showed interest and even asked about the duration. It seems Bob is genuinely trying to prioritize our home life. With that thought, I felt grateful to have married him. I think it's going to be a week from the week after next. Oh, okay, the week after next then. Bob started checking his calendar on his smartphone. I'm not sure about the details, but he seems busier than before. I wondered if he's become busier at work or perhaps more relied upon. Got it. Be careful. Okay. Yeah, thanks. We had these conversations, and on the morning of the trip, I explained various household things to Bob. Thinking he had finally understood, I briefed him on the discount store, ironing techniques, and where to find daily necessities to make things easier for him. Well, I'm off now. Call me if anything comes up. All right, thank you. With that, I headed for my business trip. That evening, when I returned to my hotel after work, I received an unusual message from Bob. How's work going? It's going well. After some casual chit-chat, I sent him a goodnight message and set my phone aside. I couldn't help but wonder if everything was okay with Bob. Was he feeling lonely all by himself? With these thoughts, I continued preparing for work. About a week later, I finished my tasks and started heading home. Luckily, I finished a day earlier than planned. If no last-minute work comes up, I'll have tomorrow off. Feeling happy on my way back, I thought about cooking dinner and stopped by the supermarket. What should I cook? Curry, stew. Then I realized we might be out of oil, and it dawned on me that I hadn't informed Bob about my early return. Would he be surprised if I just showed up? I texted Bob to check if we had oil at home and to let him know that my business trip had ended early and I was on my way home. However, even after circling the supermarket, there was no reply from Bob. Was he still working? Doing overtime? Deciding not to disturb him further, I picked up a bottle of oil, thinking it's always good to have some extra. While heading home after shopping, Bob called. "Hey, are you coming home now? Where are you?" For some reason, he sounded panicked. Was something wrong? Yeah, I'm in the apartment elevator right now. Bob hung up without saying anything else. What's happening? Worried, I hurried to our apartment. "I'm home, Edward. Are you okay?" I called out, but there was no answer. Just as I was taking off my shoes and heading inside, my husband rushed out of the living room and collapsed in front of me. "Are you okay? It's hard to breathe. Call an ambulance," he said, grabbing my hand. I dialed 911 quickly. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived. I let the paramedics in, and they checked on my husband. "Will he be okay? What's going to happen?" While watching and worrying, I noticed something strange. There were a pair of women's shoes I didn't recognize. Obviously, they weren't the paramedics or mine. I felt a tightness in my chest. Glancing at the living room window, I saw a women's lingerie hanging there. Could it be? Is Edward having an affair? Looking back, he did seem very panicked when I called. Maybe he was trying to hide it. I cautiously scanned the house, pretending to prepare for my husband's hospital visit to avoid suspicion. Living room, restroom, kitchen, no sign of her. If her shoes are here, she must be around, unless she escaped through a window. Finally, in the bathroom, I see a light on and a silhouette. I open the door and look at the bathtub. I can't believe what's in front of me. I wish I had been mistaken about the shoes and the lingerie. I head back to the front door. The conversation with the paramedics goes like this. "You're his family, right? Please come with us." "I'm sorry, there's been a mistake." The paramedics sound shocked. Edward too lets out a surprised sound. Ignoring them, I bring the woman from the bathroom to the front door. "This woman is family, she'll come with us." Wait a minute, the woman gets flustered. Edward seems shocked too, and suddenly sits up with force. "You." The paramedics quickly try to calm down Edward, but he seems fine. "What do you think?" "Well, he doesn't seem to be in critical condition." In the end, it's decided that Edward doesn't need immediate medical attention, but if he feels unwell again, he should go to the hospital. The room falls silent after the paramedics leave. So, what's going on here? I sit both Edward and the woman down and demand an explanation. At first, they look uncomfortable and remain silent. But as I continue to stare silently, they seem to give in. Edward speaks up. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding. She's a colleague from work. We're close, but there's nothing going on." Following Edward, the colleague chimes in. "That's right. We were just having a meeting here. There's nothing going on, I promise. Now, can you explain this? Do you need to take a bath for a meeting? Do you need to dry your underwear too?" I gesture to the underwear hanging in the living room. The two exchange uneasy glances, appearing troubled. I see through their facade. "If you have time to come up with a strange excuse, just tell me the truth." I press them. Edward looks up, his expression heavy with guilt, and finally spills everything. "I'm really sorry. I know sorry isn't enough." "So, you've been lying about working late?" It turns out Edward had developed a close relationship with his colleague Kate. After we got married, he started cheating because I kept nagging him about household chores. But when Kate praised men who do chores, Edward started working late to meet her. I noticed the smug look on Kate's face. That explains the lack of overtime pay and his supposed certifications. It was all a facade. "I understand what you're thinking. Let's just end it with a divorce," I declared. "Please go ahead and be with her." I was so fed up that divorce seemed like the only solution. It wasn't a threat. The deception I had endured had become unbearable. But Edward wouldn't hear of it. "Divorce? That's not the answer," he insisted. "If you had told me you were coming home, none of this would have happened." "Yeah, it's not fair to come home unannounced." They both chimed in. Had I been deceived by my husband's facade all this time? The realization left me feeling pathetic. "Ma'am, look, Edward really regrets it." Kate tried to calm me down. "You don't truly want a divorce, do you? You're just blaming me for his cheating," she accused. "Enough is enough. Let's get a divorce," I shouted, and they both recoiled. I hoped they would reflect on their actions and words. Afterward, I hired a lawyer and began preparing for divorce proceedings to claim my share of the assets. Edward kept calling, and even his parents reached out. They were understanding, and upon hearing my side, they apologized and agreed to support me in the divorce. Eventually, after likely talking to Edward, he appeared exhausted during the divorce proceedings and agreed to it without resistance. I reported Edward and Kate's affair to their company. Following the divorce, John and Kate, both employed at the same company, were quickly exposed for their affair. They faced ostracism from colleagues and seemed to lose their standing within the company. Additionally, they became the subject of gossip among talkative older women, and even clients began discussing it. Unable to endure the toxic environment, they resigned from their jobs. I'm uncertain if they married, but they likely faced financial strain. If they did marry, I can imagine them arguing over money. I promptly moved to a new, more comfortable and affordable apartment. Reflecting, I recall choosing the old place to accommodate John's preferences. As I return home, I exhale a sigh of relief, grateful that chapter of my life has closed. Since the divorce, I've dedicated myself more to work, leading to significant improvements in my performance and a subsequent raise. While initially made in anger, the decision to divorce now brings me a sense of liberation. With this in mind, I enjoy my favorite tea, preparing for what tomorrow may bring.
My name is Erica, and this is the story of how my life turned upside down in ways I never could have imagined. For over a decade, I'd been happily married to my husband, James. We had what I thought was a rock-solid relationship built on trust and mutual respect. I worked as a remote French tutor, a job I enjoyed despite its modest pay. James came from a well-to-do family, but that never mattered to us. His parents, however, were a different story. Richard, my father-in-law, was an influential executive director at the local hospital. His wife, Margaret, busied herself with various charitable foundations. From the moment James introduced me, they made it clear they didn't approve of me. James had a brother, Michael, who was married to Emily. They had a 13-year-old daughter named Lily. Unable to have children of my own, I doted on my niece, often taking her for weekends and outings. Emily and I had become close over the years. During one of our coffee dates, she confided in me about the family's wealth. "Erica, you wouldn't believe the amount of property and money Richard and Margaret have given Michael and me," she whispered, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "We're talking millions." I raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Millions? Where did they get that kind of money?" Emily shrugged. "I try not to think about it too much. But sometimes I joke that we're secret millionaires who can't touch our fortune." I laughed along, but a nagging feeling settled in my stomach. Something about the situation felt off, but I pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on my family and my work. Life continued this way for years, a delicate balance of family dynamics and unspoken tensions. Then, tragedy struck. Michael and Emily were killed in a car accident, leaving Lily an orphan. The funeral was a somber affair, but something about Richard and Margaret's behavior struck me as odd. They seemed distracted, almost annoyed by the proceedings, as if they had more pressing matters on their minds than grieving their son. As we stood by the graveside, I overheard Margaret muttering to Richard, "We need to sort out the paperwork as soon as possible. This complicates everything." In the days that followed, I threw myself into caring for Lily. The poor girl was devastated, and I wanted to do everything I could to comfort her. After much discussion with James, I approached him with an idea. "Honey, what if we adopted Lily?" I suggested one evening. "She needs a stable home, and we love her so much already." James considered it for a moment before nodding. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Let's talk to my parents about it." The next day, James and I visited his parents' sprawling mansion to discuss our proposal to adopt Lily. As we sat in their opulent living room, I couldn't help but feel out of place among the antique furniture and priceless artworks. "Absolutely not," Margaret snapped as soon as we broached the subject. Her eyes narrowed as she glared at me. "Erica is not suitable to be a mother to our granddaughter. We will raise Lily ourselves." I was stunned by the vehemence in her voice. "But I've been a part of Lily's life since she was born," I protested. "James and I love her, and we can provide a stable home." Richard cleared his throat, his expression cold. "This isn't up for discussion. Lily stays with us." Margaret leaned forward, her voice dripping with venom. "Besides, we all know what this is really about, don't we, Erica? You're just after Michael's money. How convenient that you can't have children of your own, and now you want to swoop in and become Lily's guardian. Did you think we wouldn't see through your little scheme? As we left the house, I felt a mix of anger and sadness washing over me. I can't believe they'd accuse me of something so horrible, I said to James as we drove home. He sighed, keeping his eyes on the road. I'm sorry, Erica. They're just protective of Lily. Give them time, they'll come around. But time didn't improve things. In fact, over the next few weeks, I noticed a change in James. He began staying late at work more often, always with some vague excuse about an important project. When he was home, he seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone and exchanging messages with someone. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table in silence, I couldn't take it anymore. James, is everything okay? You've been so distant lately. He looked up from his phone, his expression hard. It's nothing you need to concern yourself with, he snapped. I recoiled at his harsh tone. This wasn't like him at all. I'm your wife, I said softly. If something's bothering you, I want to help. Just drop it, Erica, he growled, pushing away from the table and storming out of the room. Hurt and confused, I tried to focus on the one bright spot in my life, my relationship with Lily. I visited her at Richard and Margaret's house as often as I could, helping her with her French lessons and providing a sympathetic ear for her grief. One afternoon, as Lily and I sat in the sunroom working on her conjugations, I overheard Richard and Margaret arguing in the next room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself straining to hear their heated exchange. We need to find a way to invalidate that trust fund, Richard hissed. $10 million, Margaret. $10 million that should be ours, not locked away for that girl. Margaret's voice was equally angry. Don't you think I know that? I've got the lawyers working on it, but it's not going to be easy. Michael made sure everything was ironclad before he died. I felt my blood run cold. They were talking about Lily's inheritance, the money Michael and Emily had set aside for their daughter's future. And they wanted to take it for themselves. That evening, I rushed home, prepared to tell James everything I'd overheard. But as soon as I walked through the door, I knew something was terribly wrong. James was sitting in the living room, a stack of papers on the coffee table in front of him. We need to talk, Erica, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. I approached James cautiously, the urgency of what I'd overheard momentarily forgotten. James, what's going on? He didn't meet my eyes as he pushed the stack of papers towards me. I want a divorce, Erica. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled back, gripping the edge of the sofa for support. What? Why? James, I don't understand. James finally looked up at me, his eyes cold and unfamiliar. I've met someone else. She's beautiful, intelligent, and from a good family. Everything you're not. Before I could respond, he pulled out his phone and showed me a picture. A stunning brunette smiled back at me, her arm draped possessively over James's shoulder. They looked happy, intimate. This is Amanda, James said. We've been seeing each other for a while now. I need you to sign these and leave. Tonight. Tears blurred my vision as I mechanically signed where he indicated. I felt hollow, as if someone had scooped out my insides and left me an empty shell. What about the house? Our stuff? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. James waved dismissively. We'll sort out the division of property later. I don't have time for that now. Just pack what you need for a few days and leave the rest. I nodded numbly and headed to our bedroom, no, his bedroom now, to pack a bag. As I threw clothes haphazardly into a suitcase, I heard the front door open. James? Are you home, darling? Did you get rid of her? It was Margaret's voice, sickly sweet in a way I'd never heard before. Yes, Mom, James replied. Eric is packing now. She'll be gone within the hour. Margaret clapped her hands together. Excellent. You must bring Amanda to dinner tomorrow. Your father and I are dying to meet her properly. I retreated to the bedroom, feeling sick. How could they be so callous? So cruel? I finished packing in a daze, my mind reeling from everything that had happened. When I came downstairs with my suitcase, Margaret was still there. She didn't bother to hide her triumphant smile. "Erica, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I'm so sorry things didn't work out between you and James. Besides, don't bother coming around to see Lily anymore. It's best if you make a clean break." With those final, cutting words ringing in my ears, I stepped out into the night. The door closed behind me with a finality that seemed to echo the end of my married life. I found myself at a nearby hotel, checking in for the night in a fog of disbelief and pain. As I lay in the impersonal hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, I tried to make sense of how my life had fallen apart so quickly. The next morning, operating on autopilot, I found a small apartment to rent. It was nothing like the home I'd shared with James, but it would do. I threw myself into my work, teaching French lessons online from morning till night, anything to keep my mind occupied. A week after moving into my new apartment, my phone rang. It was Lily. My heart leapt at the sound of her voice. "Aunt Erica," she said hesitantly. "Are you okay? Grandma said you and Uncle James split up." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm okay, sweetheart. These things happen sometimes. How are you doing?" As we chatted, Lily hesitantly told me about James bringing his new girlfriend to dinner. "She's pretty," Lily said. "But she's not as nice as you. I don't like her." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I changed the subject, asking about her school and her friends. But as we talked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Lily seemed nervous, on edge. Over the next few weeks, I tried to establish a new normal. One evening, as I was grading papers, my phone buzzed with a message from Lily. "Aunt Erica, I'm scared. Can we talk?" Alarmed, I immediately called her back. When she answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Aunt Erica, weird things are happening here." "What do you mean, sweetie?" I asked, concern flooding through me. Lily hesitated before continuing. "There are always these strange people coming to the house. They argue with Grandpa and Grandma a lot. They talk about money and something called a trust fund. It sounds like Grandpa and Grandma owe them something." My blood ran cold as I remembered the conversation I'd overheard about Lily's inheritance. I tried to keep my voice calm. "Lily, honey, I want you to be very careful, okay? Don't let anyone know you're telling me this." "I won't," she promised. "I've been recording some of their conversations on my phone. And I kind of got into Grandpa's computer and copied some files." I was shocked by her resourcefulness. "Lily, that's very clever, but also very dangerous. You need to be careful." The next day, I received an email from Lily. It contained audio files, photos, and documents she'd managed to gather. With shaking hands, I began to go through the material. What I discovered left me reeling. The audio recordings captured heated arguments between Richard and various individuals, all demanding repayment of large sums of money. The photos showed clandestine meetings in dimly lit rooms, with Richard handing over envelopes to shady-looking characters. But it was the documents that truly horrified me. Spreadsheets detailing the production and distribution of counterfeit medicines. Falsified lab reports. Forged prescriptions. It was all there in black and white. As I delved deeper into the files, I uncovered the true extent of the operation. Richard had set up a fictitious pharmaceutical company, using it to supply counterfeit drugs to pharmacies and clinics. Even worse, he was using these fake medicines in his own hospital, bribing doctors to cover up the deception. My hands shook as I closed my laptop. What should I do with this information? Going to the police seemed like the obvious answer, but I hesitated. What if James was involved? And what about Lily? She was living in that house, surrounded by these dangerous people. As night fell, I made a decision. Despite everything that had happened, I needed to talk to James. He deserved to know what his father was doing. I picked up my phone and dialed his number, my heart pounding. After several rings, he answered. Erica? His voice was confused, wary. Why are you calling? James, we need to talk, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's about your father. There's something you need to know. He was silent for a few seconds, and then he asked me to meet. I agreed, and James gave me an address, a small cafe on the outskirts of town. As I drove there, my emotions were in turmoil. The cafe was nearly empty when I arrived. James was sitting in a corner booth, looking haggard and older than I remembered. As I slid into the seat across from him, I noticed dark circles under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that I'd never seen before. Erica, he began, his voice low, I've been working with the police for months. We're building a case against my father and his entire operation. I stared at him, stunned. What? But, the divorce? Amanda? James ran a hand through his hair. It was all part of the cover. I needed to distance myself from you, to keep you safe. Amanda is an undercover officer. We needed a way to get her into the family circle without suspicion. My head was spinning. So, our marriage, it wasn't real? No, Erica, James said, reaching across the table to take my hand. Our marriage was the only real thing in all of this. I love you. I've always loved you. Pushing you away was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Tears welled up in my eyes as relief and anger warred within me. Why didn't you tell me? I could have helped. I couldn't risk it, James said, his voice pained. My father's network is vast. If there was even a hint that you knew something, you'd be in danger. I couldn't bear the thought of anything happening to you. As James continued to explain, I learned the full extent of the investigation. It wasn't just Richard involved, there were corrupt doctors, pharmacists, and even government officials implicated. The case was massive, with potential ramifications that reached far beyond our small town. But what about Lily? I asked, suddenly remembering my niece's fear. She's living in that house, James. She's scared. James's face darkened. I know. We're working on a way to get her out safely. But it's complicated. We talked late into the night. When we finally parted ways, James pulled me into a tight embrace. I'm so sorry for everything I put you through, he whispered. When this is all over, I promise I'll make it up to you. I clung to him, savoring the feeling of being in his arms again. But as I drove home, a nagging worry settled in my stomach. Despite James's assurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lily was in immediate danger. The next morning, I was jolted awake by the shrill ring of my phone. Lily's name flashed on the screen, and my heart raced as I answered. Aunt Erica. Lily's voice was a panicked whisper. They're packing. They keep saying they need to get out before it's too late. I sat bolt upright, fully alert now. Lily, listen to me carefully. Are you safe right now? Can they hear you? I'm hiding in my closet, she replied. But I don't know how long before they. Suddenly, there was a commotion on the other end of the line. I heard Lily gasp, followed by the muffled sound of a struggle. Lily? Lily! I shouted into the phone, but the line went dead. Panic surged through me. Without thinking, I threw on some clothes and rushed out of my apartment. I knew I should call James or the police, but there was no time. When I arrived at the house, I saw frantic activity through the windows. Shadows moved back and forth, and I could hear raised voices inside. Taking a deep breath, I approached the front door and rang the bell. For a moment, everything went quiet. Then, the door swung open, revealing Richard's surprised face. Erica? What are you doing here? He asked, his voice strained. I plastered on a fake smile. I left some of my things here when I moved out. I was hoping I could collect them. Richard's eyes narrowed suspiciously, but before he could respond, I heard Lily's voice from inside the house. Aunt Erica, help me. Without hesitation, I pushed past Richard and ran into the house. The scene that greeted me was chaos. Suitcases were strewn about, drawers left open, papers scattered everywhere. Margaret stood in the living room, gripping Lily's arm tightly. "Let her go," I demanded, my voice stronger than I felt. What happened next was a blur. Richard lunged at me, but years of yoga had made me quicker than he expected. I dodged his grasp and made a dash for Lily. Margaret, in her surprise, loosened her grip, and Lily broke free, running towards me. We almost made it to the door when I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head. Richard had grabbed a heavy bookend and struck me. I stumbled, my vision blurring, but I managed to push Lily towards the door. "Run, Lily! Get help!" I shouted as I fell to my knees. The last thing I saw was Lily's terrified face as she ran out the door. Then, darkness engulfed me. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, I found myself bound to a chair in what looked like Richard's study. My head throbbed, and I could feel something warm trickling down my neck, blood. Richard paced the room, running his hands through his hair. "We need to leave now. Before the police arrive." "What about her?" Margaret gestured towards me. Richard's eyes met mine, and I saw a coldness there that chilled me to the bone. "We can't leave any loose ends." Suddenly, we heard the distant wail of police sirens. Richard and Margaret froze, panic etched on their faces. "It's too late," Richard muttered. "We need to run. Now." As they rushed to grab their belongings, I struggled against my bonds. The sirens grew louder, and I heard car doors slamming outside. Richard and Margaret were shouting at each other now, their carefully constructed facade crumbling in the face of imminent arrest. Just as I felt the ropes loosen, the study door burst open. James rushed in, followed by several police officers. "Erica," he cried, running to my side and quickly untying me. As the police handcuffed Richard and Margaret, reading them their rights, James pulled me into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "When Lily called me, I came as fast as I could." I sagged against him, relief washing over me. "Lily? Is she safe?" James nodded. "She's outside with a social worker. She's shaken up, but she's okay." The next few days passed in a blur of police statements, medical examinations, and sleepless nights. I was diagnosed with a mild concussion from Richard's attack, but the doctors assured me I would recover fully. As I sat in the hospital bed, James by my side, we watched the news unfold on the small television in the corner of the room. The arrest of Richard, a prominent figure in our community, had sparked a media frenzy. Headlines screamed about the counterfeit drug king and the hospital of horrors. "The scale of this operation is unprecedented," a grim-faced police chief announced at a press conference. "We're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars in damages, and countless lives put at risk." As we were listening to the news, reliving the traumatic events, a knock at the door interrupted us. A tall, serious-looking woman in a suit entered the room. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "I'm Detective Laura Chen. I'm leading the investigation into your father's operation. I was hoping I could ask you both a few questions." Over the next hour, we recounted everything we knew. James explained his involvement with the police investigation, while I shared the information Lily had gathered and the events leading up to my confrontation with Richard and Margaret. Detective Chen listened intently, taking notes. When we finished, she looked at us with a mix of admiration and concern. "You've both been through a lot," she said. "And I'm afraid it's not over yet. The trial is going to be long and difficult. Are you prepared for that?" James and I exchanged a look. "We'll do whatever it takes to see justice done," I said firmly. As Detective Chen left, promising to keep us updated on the case, another visitor arrived, Lily, accompanied by her social worker. "Aunt Erica," she cried, rushing to my bedside and throwing her arms around me. I was so scared. "I thought they were going to hurt you." I held her tight, feeling her small body shake with sobs. "It's okay, sweetheart. You were so brave. You saved us all. But we have another long battle ahead of us." And long it was. The case dragged on for over 2 years, making headlines across the country. As I recovered and we tried to rebuild our lives, the trial loomed over everything. Finally, after months of testimony and mountains of evidence, the verdict came in. Richard and Margaret were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. All their assets, including the trust fund they had set up for Lily, were confiscated as proceeds of crime. As we left the courthouse after the sentencing, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but at what cost? So many lives had been destroyed, including those of people I had once considered family. After the dust settled from the trial, James and I focused on rebuilding our lives. The most important part of that was Lily. We'd grown so close during the ordeal, and now it was time to make it official. The adoption process was a whirlwind of paperwork and interviews, but finally, we stood before a judge who declared us Lily's legal guardians. As we left the courthouse, Lily between us holding both our hands, I felt a surge of emotion. "We did it," I whispered to James, tears in my eyes. He squeezed my hand. "We're a real family now." With guardianship came the responsibility of managing Lily's inheritance from her parents. It was a daunting task, but we were determined to do right by her. "What do you think about renting out the house?" James suggested one evening as we pored over financial documents. I nodded. "Good idea. We can put the rent money into a savings account for her college fund." We threw ourselves into the task, finding reliable tenants and setting up a separate account for Lily's future. It felt good to be planning for her future, to be giving her the stability she deserved after everything she'd been through. As we settled into our new normal, James approached me one night with a nervous energy about him. "Erica," he began, taking my hands in his. "These past few years, they've been hell. But they've also shown me how strong we are together. I was wondering, would you marry me again?" I laughed, tears springing to my eyes. "Are you kidding? Of course I will." We decided on a small ceremony, just close friends and family. The day arrived, bright and clear. As I slipped on my bright blue dress, a color of hope and new beginnings, I felt a sense of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. Lily knocked on the door, already in her bridesmaid dress. "Aunt Erica? You look like a princess." I twirled for her, feeling light and happy. "And you look absolutely beautiful. Are you ready to go?" She nodded eagerly, taking my hand. As we walked down the aisle together, I saw James waiting for me, his eyes shining with love. It felt like our first wedding all over again, but better, because now we knew what we could overcome together. The ceremony was simple, but beautiful. As we exchanged vows, I looked out at our small gathering of loved ones, at Lily beaming beside us, and I knew that this was exactly where I was meant to be. At the reception, James pulled me close for our first dance. "How does it feel to be Mrs. Harrison again?" he murmured in my ear. I grinned up at him. "Even better than the first time." Later, as I watched Lily twirling on the dance floor with her friends, I felt a deep sense of contentment. Our path hadn't been easy, but we'd made it through. We were stronger for it. The next week, I was back at work, tutoring my French students online. Life had returned to a kind of normal, but it was a new normal, one filled with love, laughter, and the joy of our little family. My name is Carly, and I never thought my life would turn into such a roller coaster. It all started when I was working as a perfume sales manager at a high-end department store. One day, a tall, handsome guy walked into the store. He looked nervous, fidgeting with his phone as he approached the counter. "Hi," he said, his voice a bit shaky. "I need help choosing a perfume for my mom." I couldn't help but find his concern for his mother endearing. "Don't worry," I reassured him. "We'll find something perfect. Let's start with some popular choices." As we sampled different fragrances, I learned his name was Michael. He was 28, worked for his family's construction company, and lived nearby. We chatted easily, and I found myself drawn to his warm brown eyes and shy smile. After nearly an hour, we finally settled on an elegant floral scent. As I wrapped up the bottle, Michael hesitated. Carly? Would you like to grab coffee sometime? My heart skipped a beat. I'd love to, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. That coffee date turned into dinner, which led to more dates. Michael was sweet, attentive, and made me laugh. We shared similar interests in movies, hiking, and trying new restaurants. Before I knew it, we were officially a couple. Everything was perfect until the day I met his mother, Evelyn. Michael had warned me she could be a bit intense, but nothing prepared me for the reality. We arrived at a fancy restaurant for a family dinner. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, her sharp eyes scrutinizing me as we approached. She was impeccably dressed, her graying hair styled in a severe bun. "So, this is the girl you've been seeing," she said, her tone cold. She barely acknowledged my extended hand, giving it a limp shake. Michael's father, Robert, seemed nice enough, offering a warm smile. His older brother, Thomas, gave a curt nod. As we sat down, Evelyn launched into an interrogation. "Where did you say you work, Carly?" "I'm a perfume sales manager at..." She cut me off. "Retail, how quaint. And your family? What do your parents do?" I tried to keep my voice steady. "My dad's a high school teacher, and my mom..." "A teacher?" Evelyn's eyebrows shot up. "Well, I suppose someone has to do it." The dinner continued in this vein, with Evelyn making thinly veiled insults and dismissive comments. Michael squeezed my hand under the table, but said nothing to defend me. As we left the restaurant, Evelyn pulled me aside. "Listen carefully, Carly," she hissed. "I run this family. I decide what's best for my sons. If you want a future with Michael, you'll need to prove your worth." I was too shocked to respond. When Michael proposed, I was over the moon. But my joy was short-lived. Evelyn immediately took over the wedding planning, dictating everything from the venue to the guest list. I tried to stand up for myself. "Actually, I had some ideas." "Ideas are nice, dear," Evelyn cut in, "but let's leave this to the professionals, shall we?" Michael gave me a pleading look. "Just go along with it," he whispered. "It's easier this way." And so, I watched as my dream wedding transformed into Evelyn's spectacle. I told myself it was just one day, that things would be different once we were married and living on our own. The first few months of marriage were a whirlwind. Michael and I moved into a small apartment, and I reveled in the joy of setting up our own space. But even as we unpacked boxes and arranged furniture, Evelyn's presence loomed large. She'd drop by unannounced, often when Michael was at work. "Just checking in," she'd say, her eyes scanning our home critically. "Oh dear, is this how you've arranged the living room? Let me show you a better way." I'd grit my teeth and smile, reminding myself that she was just trying to help. But her help felt more like an invasion. One evening, as Michael and I were having dinner, my phone rang. It was my boss, offering me a promotion to senior sales manager. I was thrilled. It was the opportunity I'd been working towards for years. The next evening, we sat around Evelyn's dining table. The tension was palpable as she served a roast that looked perfect, but tasted like cardboard in my mouth. "Carly," Evelyn began, her tone sickly sweet. "Michael tells me you've been offered a promotion." "How nice." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, I'm very excited about it." Evelyn's smile tightened. "Well, dear, I think it's time we discussed your future. Your real future. We need someone in sales, and with your experience, you'd be perfect." I took a deep breath. "Evelyn, I appreciate the offer, but I'm happy in my current job. I don't want to leave it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "I see. So, you don't consider yourself part of this family then?" I felt my temper rising. "With all due respect, Evelyn, you don't get to decide what's best for my marriage or my career." Evelyn stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I think you need to reconsider your priorities, young lady. Michael, talk some sense into your wife." As she stormed out of the room, I turned to Michael, expecting support. Instead, he looked torn. "Carly, maybe we should think about this. Mom knows what she's doing." The drive home was silent, filled with unspoken words and growing resentment. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that my battle wasn't just with Evelyn. It was with the entire dynamic of this family I had married into. The tension in our home grew thicker with each passing day. One Sunday afternoon, we were all gathered at Evelyn's for a barbecue. I was in the kitchen, helping to prepare salads, when Evelyn's voice carried from the patio. "It's such a shame," she was saying loudly. "I remember Thomas's ex-wife. She was just as ungrateful as Carly. But I showed her the door. I kicked her out of this family myself." I felt my cheeks burn. Thomas, Michael's older brother, shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, please," he muttered. But Evelyn was on a roll. "I'm just saying, a woman should know her place. Isn't that right, Robert?" Robert, Michael's father, just grunted noncommittally. I'd noticed he rarely spoke up against his wife. I couldn't take it anymore. I marched out to the patio, salad bowl in hand. "Evelyn," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "if you have something to say to me, why don't you say it to my face?" The backyard fell silent. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Fine. You want to know what I think? I think you're not good enough for this family. You're stubborn, you're disrespectful, and you're pulling Michael away from his responsibilities." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Responsibilities? You mean being your puppet?" "Carly," Michael pleaded. "Please, let's not do this here." I whirled on him. "And you? When are you going to stand up to her? When are you going to be a husband instead of a mama's boy?" The moment the words left my mouth, I knew I'd crossed a line. Michael's face crumpled, and Evelyn looked triumphant. "You see," she crowed. "This is who you really are. A spiteful, ungrateful girl who doesn't appreciate what she has." I felt tears pricking at my eyes. Without another word, I turned and ran into the house, grabbing my purse and keys. The weeks following the barbecue incident were tense. Michael and I barely spoke, tiptoeing around each other in our own home. I threw myself into my work, staying late at the office, to avoid the suffocating silence at home. One evening, I returned from work to find Michael sitting at the kitchen table, a serious expression on his face. "We need to talk," he said. "Mom called today. She wants us to come over for her birthday dinner next week." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "Michael, I don't think that's a good idea." "Please," he pleaded. "It would mean a lot to me. And maybe it's a chance to start over?" I wanted to refuse, to tell him I was done playing nice with a woman who clearly despised me. But the hope in his eyes made me hesitate. "Fine," I said finally. "But this is the last chance, Michael. I mean it." The night of Evelyn's birthday arrived, and I found myself standing in front of her door, a forced smile plastered on my face. As we entered, Evelyn greeted us with her usual fake warmth. "Carly, dear," she cooed, air-kissing my cheek. "So glad you could make it. I was worried you might be too busy with your little job." I bit my tongue, reminding myself to stay calm. The evening progressed with forced pleasantries and thinly veiled insults. I noticed how Evelyn dominated every conversation, her sons and husband merely nodding along. As the night wore on, Evelyn announced it was time for cake. "Carly, be a dear and bring out the cake. And don't forget the candles." I headed to the kitchen, grateful for a moment's respite. I carefully placed the candles on the cake, counting under my breath to make sure I had the right number. Back in the dining room, I set the cake down in front of Evelyn. Her eyes narrowed as she counted the candles. "Carly," she said, her voice dangerously sweet. "There's one extra candle here. Can't you even do a simple task correctly? Or perhaps you're trying to insinuate something about my age?" "No, of course not, Enough," Evelyn snapped. She began plucking out the candles one by one. Since you've clearly ruined the design, you might as well see the mess you've made. Come closer, dear. Take a good look. Hesitantly, I leaned in. Suddenly, I felt a hand on the back of my head, pushing me down. Before I could react, my face was shoved into the cake. I gasped, struggling to breathe as frosting filled my nose and mouth. After what felt like an eternity, Evelyn released me. I straightened up, sputtering and wiping cake from my eyes. The room was silent, save for Evelyn's cruel laughter. Oh dear, she chuckled. Looks like someone's made a mess of themselves. I looked around the room in disbelief. The other guests were averting their eyes, some letting out nervous giggles. And Michael. Michael was staring at the floor, his face red with embarrassment. Without a word, I turned and fled to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. As I scrubbed the cake from my face, I could hear muffled voices outside. A soft knock came at the door. Carly? It was Michael. Are you okay? Do you need help? I yanked the door open, fixing him with a glare. Help? Now you want to help? He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. Mom can be a bit eccentric sometimes. We just need to. Eccentric? I hissed. Michael, she assaulted me. And you just stood there. Without another word, I pushed past him, grabbed my purse, and headed for the door. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling from what had just happened. The days following Evelyn's birthday disaster were a blur of tears, arguments, and sleepless nights. Michael tried to apologize, but his words rang hollow. I threw myself into work, staying late at the office and taking on extra projects. But even at work, I couldn't escape Evelyn's influence. One afternoon, as I was assisting a customer, I heard a familiar voice that made my blood run cold. Excuse me, I'd like to speak to a manager. I turned to see Evelyn standing there, a malicious glint in her eye. My colleague, unaware of who she was, directed her to me. I'm the senior sales manager. How can I help you? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Evelyn's lips curled into a cruel smile. I have a complaint about the perfume I purchased here last week. The problem is that this perfume smells like cheap chemicals. And when I tried to return it, your staff was incredibly rude to me. I knew she was lying. We had a strict quality control process, and our return policy was more than fair. But before I could respond, she continued her tirade. This is unacceptable. I demand to speak to your superior immediately. My manager, alerted by the commotion, hurried over. What seems to be the problem here? Evelyn launched into her fabricated story, painting me as an incompetent manager who had personally sold her a defective product and then refused to help. I tried to interject, to explain the situation, but my manager held up a hand to silence me. I'm very sorry for your experience, ma'am. Please, come with me to my office. We'll sort this out immediately. As they walked away, Evelyn shot me a triumphant look over her shoulder. I stood there, humiliated and angry, as my colleagues whispered around me. An hour later, my manager called me into his office. His expression was grim. Carly, I've received multiple complaints about your performance recently. And after today's incident, I'm afraid we're going to have to let you go. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. What? But those complaints, they're not real. It's my mother-in-law, she's trying to. He held up a hand. Carly, please. I understand you're going through some personal issues, but we can't have them affecting your work like this. I'm sorry, but my decision is final. I left the office in a daze, my personal belongings in a small box. I drove home, tears blurring my vision. When I arrived, Michael was waiting, his face etched with concern. Carly, what happened? Mom said. Your mother, I spat, just cost me my job. I recounted the events of the day, my voice rising with each word. And you want to know the worst part? She used our phone number to file those fake complaints. Our phone number, Michael. The one you gave her without even asking me. I locked myself in our bedroom, ignoring his pleas from the other side of the door. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I realized I was at a crossroads. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly under attack from Evelyn and unsupported by my own husband. The weeks following my job loss were some of the darkest I'd ever experienced. One evening, as I sat at our kitchen table, surrounded by job listings and unanswered applications, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "I hear you're looking for work. Maybe it's time to reconsider my offer. Evelyn." I stared at the screen in disbelief. How had she gotten my new number? I'd changed it specifically to avoid her. As if on cue, Michael walked in. I held up my phone. "Did you give your mother my new number?" His hesitation was all the answer I needed. "Look, maybe we should consider her offer. It's for us. For our future." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "Our future? Michael, there won't be a future if this keeps up. If something doesn't change, and soon, I don't know if I can stay in this marriage." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael looked stunned, as if he couldn't quite process what I'd said. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll talk to her. I promise. Just give me some time." I wanted to believe him, but I'd heard similar promises before. Still, what choice did I have? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't wait for Michael to stand up to his mother. I needed to find a job, to regain some semblance of independence. I reached out to an old colleague who had started her own online perfume business. She was sympathetic to my situation and offered me a position as an online consultant. The pay wasn't great, but it was something, a lifeline in the storm. But Evelyn wasn't done with me yet. As Christmas approached, the annual family gathering loomed on the horizon. I dreaded it, knowing it would be another opportunity for Evelyn to belittle and humiliate me. The night before the gathering, Michael and I had another argument. He wanted me to make more of an effort with his mother, to try to understand her perspective. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Her perspective?" I sputtered. "Michael, her perspective is that I'm not good enough for this family, that I should quit my job and become her puppet. How am I supposed to understand that?" He looked away, unable to meet my eyes. "She's just set in her ways. If we could just..." "No," I cut him off. "I'm done trying. If you won't stand up for me, for us, then I'll have to do it myself." As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. Tomorrow, at the Christmas gathering, I would confront Evelyn once and for all. I was tired of being a victim, of letting her control my life. Christmas morning arrived, and with it, a sense of foreboding. We arrived to find Evelyn's house already bustling with activity. As we moved into the living room, I could feel Evelyn's eyes on me, assessing and judging. The rest of the family was already there, Robert, Thomas, and various aunts, uncles, and cousins. The afternoon progressed with forced pleasantries and thinly veiled insults. Evelyn, as usual, held court, dominating every conversation. I noticed how she kept bringing up the topic of children, her eyes darting to me each time. Finally, during dinner, she addressed me directly. "Carly, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "I couldn't help but notice you're not drinking. Any special reason?" I felt my cheeks flush as all eyes turned to me. "No, Evelyn. I'm just not in the mood for alcohol." Her eyes narrowed. Well, I do hope you're not having difficulties in that area. It's just, well, you're not getting any younger. And with your career struggles, I thought perhaps you'd be focusing on more important matters by now." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "More important matters? You mean like being a submissive wife who gives up her dreams to please her mother-in-law?" Gasps echoed around the table. Evelyn's face contorted with rage. "How dare you speak to me like that in my own home?" "No, Evelyn," I shot back. "How dare you treat me like this?" I am your son's wife, not your punching bag. I've had enough of your manipulation and your cruelty. I turned to leave, but as I passed Evelyn, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Evelyn made a sudden movement, knocking over her mug of hot tea. The scalding liquid splashed directly onto me. I screamed in pain as the hot tea soaked through my clothes. Evelyn, however, seemed unfazed by what she had done. She grabbed my arm, pulling me close. "Listen here, you little brat," she hissed, her voice low and menacing. "You will obey me. You will do as I say, or I will destroy you." Through the haze of pain, I looked around the room, desperate for help. But everyone, including Michael, seemed frozen in shock. Finally Michael stood up, his face pale. I need some air," he mumbled, before fleeing the room. In that moment, something inside me broke. Without another word, I wrenched my arm free and ran out of the house, ignoring the chaos erupting behind me. I drove to the nearest hospital, my skin still burning from the tea. As the doctors treated my burns, which thankfully weren't severe, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. When I finally returned home, the apartment was empty. I packed a bag with essentials, wrote a brief note explaining that I needed time away, and left. I woke up in the dingy motel room, my skin still tender from the burns. As I was contemplating my next move, my phone rang. I hesitated, half expecting it to be Michael or worse, Evelyn. To my surprise, it was my father-in-law, Robert. "Carly?" His voice sounded strained. "Can we meet? It's important." Curiosity got the better of me. "Okay," I said, giving him the motel address. An hour later, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Robert standing there, looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen him. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he seemed to have aged overnight. "Robert, what's going on?" I asked, gesturing for him to sit down. "Carly, I'm so sorry," he blurted out as soon as I let him in. "There's something you need to know about the company, about Evelyn." He paused, his hands shaking slightly. "The company, it used to belong to my parents. Evelyn, she tricked my father when he was sick. Made him sign everything over to her, made herself the executive director." I felt my jaw drop. "What? But how? Why didn't you say anything?" Robert's eyes filled with tears. "I was a coward. I'd been collecting evidence for years, but I was too afraid to do anything with it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder. "But I can't stay silent anymore. Not after what happened yesterday. I need your help, Carly." With trembling hands, I opened the folder and began to read. What I found inside made my blood run cold. Evelyn had been hiding income for years, evading taxes on a massive scale. She'd been hiring undocumented workers, paying them a fraction of what they deserved and forcing them to work in appalling conditions. These workers, afraid of deportation, never complained about their treatment. But it got worse. The documents showed that many of the company's products were defective, failing to meet basic quality standards. Evelyn had been knowingly selling these subpar goods at full price, putting profits over people's safety. Then I came across a police report that made my heart stop. Thomas's ex-wife, who had worked in production, had discovered these illegal practices. She had threatened to report Evelyn to the authorities. In response, Evelyn had pushed her down a flight of stairs. The poor woman had sustained serious injuries, but Evelyn had intimidated her into silence. Shortly after, she had pressured Thomas into divorcing his wife. I looked up at Robert, my hands shaking. This is horrible. How could she do all this?" Robert broke down, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, Carly. I should have spoken up years ago. I was afraid. Of her, of losing everything. But I can't live with this guilt anymore." As I watched my father-in-law cry, a mix of emotions washed over me. Anger at Evelyn's cruelty and greed. Sympathy for Robert and all the workers who had suffered. And a growing determination to put an end to this injustice. We contacted a reputable lawyer, Amanda Chen, who specialized in corporate fraud cases. She listened to our story with growing concern and immediately agreed to take on the case. It was a Tuesday afternoon when all hell broke loose. My phone exploded with notifications, missed calls, text messages, and voicemails, all from Evelyn. I steeled myself and listened to one of the voicemails. "You ungrateful little witch." Evelyn's voice screeched through the speaker. "How dare you turn my husband against me? I'll ruin you for this, do you hear me? I'll destroy you." The barrage continued relentlessly. Evelyn called every few minutes, alternating between threats and attempts at manipulation. When I blocked her number, she started using other people's phones. But it didn't stop there. Evelyn launched a full-scale character assassination campaign against me. She contacted friends, family, and even my former co-workers, spinning a tale of how I had seduced Robert and turned him against her. The biggest blow came when Michael sided with his mother. He showed up at my new rented apartment, his face a mask of anger and betrayal. "How could you do this to us?" he demanded. "To my mother?" I tried to explain, to show him the evidence, but he refused to listen. "I don't know who you are anymore," he spat before storming out. As I sat there, reeling from Michael's rejection, I received an unexpected call. It was Thomas, Michael's older brother. "Carly? It's Thomas. I heard what's happening. I want you to know, I believe you. And I want to help." Thomas's support was a turning point. He provided additional evidence of Evelyn's misdeeds and agreed to testify in court. With his help, we were also able to locate his ex-wife, Maria. Maria's testimony was damning. She recounted in detail the incident where Evelyn had pushed her down the stairs, as well as the subsequent threats and intimidation. As the trial date approached, Amanda worked tirelessly. She tracked down several of the undocumented workers Evelyn had exploited. Despite their fear, many agreed to testify, their stories painting a horrifying picture of abuse and exploitation. The trial was grueling. Evelyn's lawyers fought dirty, trying to discredit our witnesses and paint Robert and me as conspirators. But Amanda was brilliant, methodically presenting our evidence and dismantling the defense's arguments. The turning point came when Amanda presented the evidence of how Evelyn had manipulated Robert's father into signing over the company. The judge listened intently as Amanda argued for the annulment of the will. After what felt like an eternity, the judge made her ruling. The will was annulled, and ownership of the company was returned to Robert. Furthermore, the judge ordered a full investigation into the company's practices and Evelyn's personal finances. As the gavel fell, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Robert broke down in tears beside me, while Evelyn's shrieks of outrage echoed through the courtroom. The aftermath of the trial brought sweeping changes to everyone involved. As soon as Robert took control of the company, Michael, true to his mother's influence, resigned from his position. He cut off all communication with his father, unable to forgive what he saw as a betrayal of his mother. Robert found unexpected support in Thomas. The father and eldest son, both having experienced Evelyn's manipulation firsthand, formed a strong partnership. Together, they began the arduous task of restructuring the company, determined to run it ethically and efficiently. The legal proceedings didn't end with the trial. Robert filed for divorce, a process that was surprisingly quick given Evelyn's fall from grace. In the settlement, he left her the house they had shared for decades. It was a generous gesture, considering everything that had happened. The court ordered a thorough audit of the company's finances, and the results were staggering. Years of creative accounting and tax evasion came to light. Evelyn was hit with a massive fine and ordered to pay $500,000 in back taxes. The house Robert had left her became her only asset, and she was forced to sell it to settle her debts with the tax authorities. Meanwhile, my own marriage had crumbled beyond repair. Michael's unwavering loyalty to his mother, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of her misdeeds, was something I couldn't comprehend or accept. We filed for divorce, and I felt a mixture of sadness and relief as I signed the papers. As I contemplated my next steps, Robert approached me with an unexpected offer. "Carly," he said, his voice warm with gratitude, "I know you've been through hell because of our family. But I want you to know that I consider you family still. We're rebuilding the sales department, and I'd like you to be a part of it. What do you say?" I was touched by his offer and, after some consideration, I accepted. Months passed, and slowly but surely, I found my footing. I learned to navigate the intricacies of the construction business, mastering the art of selling everything from lumber to specialized tools. My experience in luxury retail, surprisingly, proved valuable in dealing with high-end clients and custom projects. It was on a routine shopping trip that I had an unexpected encounter. As I turned down the cereal aisle, I froze. There, just a few feet away, stood Michael and Evelyn. They looked haggard, a far cry from the polished appearance they once maintained. Evelyn's voice, shrill and angry, carried clearly. "You weak-willed idiot," she berated Michael. "Can't you do anything right?" "I asked for the bran flakes, not this sugary garbage." Michael, his shoulders slumped, muttered an apology and reached for another box. I felt a pang of pity, seeing how their toxic relationship had endured and seemingly worsened. For a moment, I considered approaching them. But as I watched their dysfunctional interaction, I realized I had nothing to say. Instead, I quietly turned my cart around and left the store, leaving my shopping unfinished. My world changed drastically when I was just 5. Dad had passed away from a sudden heart attack, and not long after, Mom decided to remarry. His name was George. He had a rough look and even a rougher way of talking, something that seemed to scare me right from the get-go. George brought not just his belongings into our little home, but his daughter, Liza, who was 2 years my senior and, as I'd soon find out, twice as mean. I remember the first time I met Liza. She had this smug smile plastered across her face, looking down at me as if I was some sort of bug she found amusing. "So, you're the baby of the house?" "Well, not anymore. Better get used to it," Liza sneered, her eyes scanning me like I was her new project to fix or break. Mom tried to make things sound all sugar-coated when she talked about them moving in. "Ella, honey, it's going to be wonderful to have a bigger family. Liza will be like the older sister you never had." But Liza was no sister to me. The first few days she moved in, she laid down the law, her law. My toys weren't mine anymore, they were ours, which meant they were hers whenever she wanted. And when I protested? Well, let's just say George didn't like that at all. "Ella, stop being selfish. Learn to share with your sister," he'd grumble, his voice deep and usually laced with annoyance. Mom never stood up to him. Whenever I went to her, hoping she'd take my side just this once, she'd always have the same old tired lines. "Ella, please. Just try a little harder to get along. For me, okay?" She'd plead, her eyes always looking a bit too tired, a bit too sad. Liza knew she had the upper hand, and she milked it every chance she got. If she broke something, somehow it was my fault. If she lost something, somehow I had stolen it. But one particular afternoon sticks out in my memory like a sore thumb. Liza had been particularly cruel that day, hiding my favorite doll and claiming she had no idea where it was. I found it later, tossed in the trash can outside. I remember holding the dirty, slightly torn doll as I walked into the house, tears streaming down my face. "Look what she did, Mom. Look." I cried, holding up the doll for her to see. Mom glanced at the doll, then at my tear-stained face, and for a moment, I thought she'd finally see my side. But then her eyes shifted towards the living room where George was sitting, watching TV. "Ella, maybe it was an accident. Just let it go, please," she whispered, her voice tense as she glanced nervously towards the living room. Liza just laughed from the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. "Crybaby," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for me to hear. That night, as I lay in bed clutching the now clean but still ripped doll, I realized that this was my new normal. Liza wasn't going anywhere, and neither was George. And Mom, well, she was there but not really there for me. Things took a sharper turn when Mom announced she was pregnant. I remember feeling a mix of emotions. A little brother or sister could mean someone else on my side, right? Wrong. It just meant more reasons for Mom and George to pay attention to anything but me. Tommy was born on a chilly morning in November. He was a quiet baby, hardly ever cried, but he needed constant attention, as all babies do. Mom was either feeding him, changing him, or trying to catch a few minutes of sleep. And George? Well, he was over the moon about having a son. Liza and I were pushed further to the back burner. But while I felt more isolated, Liza seemed to relish it. It was like she thrived on the chaos, knowing she could get away with anything as the focus wasn't on us anymore. One evening, I was trying to finish some homework at the kitchen table, struggling to concentrate over the sound of Tommy's fussing. Liza waltzed in, dropped her bag on the table, and scattered my papers everywhere. "Hey, I was using those," I snapped, my frustration peaking. "So? Move over, I need the table," Liza retorted, not even looking at me as she started to rummage through her bag. Before I could say anything else, George stormed into the kitchen. "What's all this noise about? Can't you see your mother's trying to get Tommy to sleep?" "Liza's trying to take over the table when I'm still using it," I said, standing my ground despite the knot in my stomach. George's face turned a shade I knew too well, and his voice was even and dangerous. "Ella, stop your complaining and go to your room. Let your sister use the table." "But Dad." "He's not your dad. Don't call him that." Liza cut in, her words sharp and biting. That stung more than I expected, and without another word, I grabbed my things and stormed off to my room, slamming the door behind me. I pressed my back against it, sliding down to the floor as I fought back tears. I felt so alone, cornered in a house that no longer felt like home. After that night, I learned to keep my head down. Liza took advantage, of course, always finding new ways to torment me when no one else was looking. George never did anything about it. If anything, he seemed to agree with whatever Liza said, which only made her bolder. "Shouldn't you be nicer to me? I mean, we're practically sisters." I once tried to reason with her, hoping to break through her tough exterior. Liza laughed, cold and harsh. "We're not sisters. We're not even friends. Remember that." And I did. Every single day that I lived in that house, I remembered. My room became my sanctuary, the only place I felt somewhat safe. But even there, the sounds of a happy family, a family that didn't include me, filtered through the walls, a constant reminder of where I stood. As soon as I finished high school, I knew I had to get out. Staying in that house wasn't an option anymore. It was suffocating, like trying to breathe underwater. So, I moved to the city. It was a fresh start, a chance to be who I wanted to be without anyone hovering over me, dictating what I could or couldn't do. The first few weeks were tough. I remember walking into my tiny studio apartment for the first time, feeling a mix of excitement and terror. It was all on me now. No more Liza, no more George, just Ella, trying to make it on her own. I found a job at a local cafe to pay the bills and signed up for a nail technician course. Nails were something I always loved doing, a creative outlet that let me escape the real world for a bit. The course was tougher than I expected. The instructor, Mrs. Jenkins, was a stickler for perfection. "If you're going to do it right," she'd often say, peering over her glasses as she inspected our work. I pushed through, got my license, and started looking for a place to set up shop. The perfect spot turned out to be a small room on the ground floor of an old building. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The landlady, Mrs. Petrov, was a tough old bird who'd seen it all. When I went to sign the lease, she eyed me skeptically. "You sure you can handle this, girlie? It's a tough business." I met her gaze, my resolve firm. "Yes, Mrs. Petrov. I can handle it." She grunted, handing over the keys. "We'll see. Pay your rent on time and we won't have any problems." Starting my own business was brutal. Money was tight, and there were days I barely made enough to cover lunch. But slowly, word got out. My clients liked my work, and they started bringing their friends. Positive reviews trickled in, and with each one, my confidence grew. Just when I thought I had everything figured out, life decided to throw me a curveball. It was a typical busy Tuesday when my phone rang, the screen flashing mom, which usually meant something was up. I took a deep breath before answering. "Hi, Mom. What's up?" I tried to keep my tone light, but I was already bracing for whatever was coming. "Ella, sweetheart, I hope you're sitting down. I have a favor to ask," Mom began, her voice shaky, which immediately put me on edge. "I'm at work, Mom. What's going on?" I wiped my hands on a towel, stepping into the back room of my salon. "It's about your sister, Liza. She's moving to your city and needs a place to stay, just for a little while, until she finds a job," Mom explained, her words rushing out like she wanted to get it over with as quickly as possible. I felt my stomach drop. "Liza? Mom, are you serious?" There was a heavy sigh from her end. I know it's a lot to ask, but she's trying to start over, Ella. She's changed, she really has." The idea of living with Liza again made my skin crawl, but hearing the pleading in Mom's voice, I was torn. "I don't know, Mom. Please, Ella. For me? It won't be for long, I promise." And just like that, I found myself agreeing to let Liza stay. "Fine, but just for a little while, okay?" "Thank you, darling. I'll let her know." The next day, Liza arrived at my doorstep with 2 suitcases and a smile that looked too sweet to be genuine. "Hey, Ella. Long time, no see, huh? Thanks for letting me crash here. I really appreciate it," she chirped, stepping inside before I could even respond. "Yeah, sure. Let's just make sure it's temporary, okay?" I said, eyeing her suitcases with suspicion. Liza laughed, a bit too loudly. "Of course. I'll be out of your hair before you know it." The first week wasn't as bad as I expected. Liza seemed like she was really trying to make an effort. She cleaned up after herself, made small talk, and even offered to split groceries. "So, how's the job hunt going?" I asked one evening as we shared a surprisingly pleasant dinner. Good. I've got a couple of interviews lined up next week," Liza replied, sounding optimistic. "That's great. Just remember, you can't stay here forever," I reminded her, not wanting her to get too comfortable. Liza nodded, her expression serious. "I know, Ella. And thanks again. I know I wasn't the best sister back in the day, but I'm trying to make things right." I wanted to believe her, I really did. But there was always that nagging doubt in the back of my mind, remembering all the times she had deceived me before. As days turned into weeks, I noticed a shift in Liza's behavior. She started coming home late, missing her interviews, and hanging out with a questionable crowd. The old Liza was resurfacing. "Liza, we need to talk," I finally said one night after she stumbled in past midnight. "What's up?" Liza slurred slightly, clearly having had a few drinks. "This isn't working. You said you'd look for a job, but all you're doing is partying. You need to get it together or find somewhere else to live," I said firmly, my patience wearing thin. Liza rolled her eyes, her old defiance flashing. "Chill, Ella. I'll get a job. Just relax." But I couldn't relax. Not with her in my house, disrupting the peace I had worked so hard to build. Liza's promises of job hunting had quickly dissolved into late nights and shady new friends who seemed to pop in and out of my apartment like it was a downtown bar. My patience was wearing thin, and I was close to kicking her out when I met Alex at a friend's party. Alex was different from anyone I'd ever met. He was genuine and seemed genuinely interested in what I did for a living, unlike most guys who glossed over it once they heard nail technician. "So, you really run your own business? That's pretty impressive," Alex said as we sat tucked away in a quieter corner of the noisy living room. "Yeah, it's been a wild ride, but I love it. It's mine, you know?" I replied, feeling a spark of pride flicker within. We started seeing each other, and things were going great, except for one thing, Liza. She had taken an unsettling interest in Alex. At first, it was just lingering looks, but then she started making excuses to stick around whenever he came over. It wasn't long before I caught her trying to be a little too friendly. One evening, I came home earlier than usual to find Liza draped a bit too close to Alex on the sofa, laughing at something he said. The scene made my blood boil. "Having fun?" I asked, my voice sharp as I dropped my keys on the counter a little louder than necessary. Liza jumped up, a guilty flush on her face. "Oh, hey, Ella. We were just chatting, getting to know each other better." Alex looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Liza and me. "Yeah, just talking. Ella, can we chat for a sec?" I nodded, pulling him aside into the kitchen. Once out of earshot, I didn't waste time. "What was that all about?" Alex rubbed the back of his neck, looking genuinely confused. "I'm not sure. She's been really forward lately." I didn't want to say anything. I didn't know how to handle it without making things weird for you. Determined to put an end to it, I confronted Liza later that night. "We need to talk, now," I said, standing at the entrance of her room. She looked up, feigning innocence. "What's up?" "You know what? This thing with Alex? It ends now. He's not interested, Liza. Back off," I stated bluntly, my tone broking no argument. Liza's face twisted into a sneer. "Oh, come on, Ella. What's the harm in a little fun? Alex doesn't seem to mind." That was the last straw. I couldn't have her in my apartment any longer. "Pack your stuff. You need to leave. First thing tomorrow," I said firmly. Liza looked stunned, finally realizing I was serious. "You can't kick me out. Where will I go?" "That's not my problem. You should have thought of that before," I replied, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. It hurt, but it was necessary. The next morning, Liza left. She was out of my life again, and this time I hoped it was for good. As she walked out the door, her parting shot was, "You'll regret this, Ella. I promise you that." As the wedding day approached, the air was thick with excitement and a bit of last-minute chaos. Alex's mom, Janet, who used a wheelchair, had become more like family to me. We'd spent countless afternoons together, chatting and planning the wedding. "I always hoped Alex would find someone who cares as much as you do, Ella. You're a blessing to us," Janet would often say with a warm smile, making me feel all the more welcomed and loved in this new family. The day of the wedding rehearsal finally came, and our close friends and relatives gathered at the venue. Everyone was buzzing with happiness, everyone except for one, Liza. When she arrived, wearing a dress that was way too revealing for a family gathering, I felt my stomach churn. She sauntered around Alex, laughing too loudly at his jokes, touching his arm every chance she got. My heart pounded with annoyance, and I could feel Alex's discomfort. "I need a minute," I muttered to Alex and pulled him aside, out of earshot from the others. "I can't stand watching her hang all over you. It's disrespectful, and it's supposed to be our special day." Alex took my hands in his expression softening. "Hey, look at me. Nothing she does changes how I feel about you. Okay? She's background noise, that's all." I nodded, trying to calm down, when Liza's laughter echoed across the room, slicing through the chatter like a knife. I snapped. Striding over to where Liza was standing, I fixed her with a glare that I hoped would melt steel. "Liza, you need to leave. Now," I said, my voice louder than intended, drawing a few curious glances from the guests. Liza's eyes widened, but she didn't make a scene. Instead, she scoffed, flipped her hair over her shoulder, and walked out without another word. Relief washed over me as I watched her leave. Turning back to the gathering, I caught my mom's eye. She approached, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "What was that all about?" Mom asked, her voice low. "I don't want her here, Mom. Not today, not at the wedding. She's done enough damage," I said, my voice firm. Mom nodded, her eyes softening. "I understand, honey. And well, there's something you should know about George. He and I are divorced. He turned out to be much worse than we thought, especially after the drinking got bad. He's not just out of my life, he's out of ours completely." My mind reeled. And Liza? She's on her own now. George had a stroke and can barely manage, she's looking after him. They're not our concern anymore, Ella, Mom added, almost as if she were convincing herself too. The drama was behind us, and all that was left was to look forward to the beginning of a new chapter with Alex, free from the shadows of the past. The first year of marriage had flown by, seemingly perfect, with me setting up a small space in our apartment to continue my nail business. It was an ideal setup. I could work while still being there for Janet, my mother-in-law, who needed daily care due to her disability. Things seemed to be going well, until I started noticing a change in Alex. He began working late more often and his business trips became more frequent. At first, I thought it was just the strain of new responsibilities at work, but then I began to feel the distance between us growing. And my worries only deepened the day I overheard Janet talking on the phone while I was setting up my tools for a client. "Yes, my dear, I'm so excited. A grandson will be such a joy." She chuckled into the receiver. I paused, my heart skipping a beat. I was definitely not pregnant. Something didn't add up. After her call, I approached her, trying to sound casual. "Janet, who's having a grandson? Did I hear you right?" She looked up, startled, then flushed a deep red. "Oh, just messing with my old friend, dear. You know, making her jealous." It sounded off. Way off. My gut twisted with suspicion, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator. One of my regular clients, Maria, who used to work as a PI, still had all her contacts. "Maria, I need to find out what's going on. Can you help me?" I asked during her appointment. "Of course, Ella. Give me a few days. I'll dig around and see what I can find," she assured me, her tone serious and professional. It didn't take long for Maria to get back to me with news that felt like a punch to the gut. Alex was having an affair. And not just with anyone, with Liza. She was pregnant. I felt a cold calm settle over me as I processed the betrayal. I didn't confront Alex. Instead, I waited, gathering my strength for what came next. The opportunity presented itself when Alex walked through the door with a set of divorce papers in his hand. "Ella, I'm sorry, but this just isn't working. I've met someone else," he said bluntly, his eyes not meeting mine. "Oh? And who might that be, Alex?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "It's Liza. She's expecting my child." "She's exciting, Ella." You've just become too predictable, too dull," he admitted coldly. "Pack your stuff." I signed the papers then and there, handing them back to him with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Before I go, Alex, just one last thing." He looked at me, confused. "What?" "Liza will be bringing her father with her." "Did she tell you that?" "He had a stroke and can't take care of himself. And he's got debts, massive ones, from the divorce settlement with my mother." "Good luck handling that," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth but necessary. Alex's face paled. "What? No, she didn't mention any. And there's more. I've filed a lawsuit for adultery. With proof. You'll be hearing from my lawyer," I continued, cutting him off. As I walked out, the cool air hit my face, and I felt a sense of freedom. The pain of betrayal still stung, but I knew I was moving towards something better. Something that was truly meant for me. After the dust settled from the divorce, the settlement from Alex and Liza was substantial enough that I could finally open my own nail salon, a dream I had shelved in the quieter corners of my mind for too long. The grand opening of Ella's Elegance was a hit. The local newspaper even covered the event, and the community support was overwhelming. I hired a few skilled technicians, and we quickly became a favorite in town for our meticulous work and calming atmosphere. One quiet afternoon, while I was sorting through some inventory in the back, my mom called. I always looked forward to our talks. They were the little moments of peace in my often hectic days. "Hi, Mom, what's up?" I asked, smiling as I paused to sit down. Oh, nothing much. I just heard from an old friend of mine. Liza had her baby, she said hesitantly, probably expecting me to react negatively. Instead, I found myself smiling, genuinely hoping that child brought her more joy than she had brought to others. That's good to hear, Mom. I hope they're both healthy. Speaking of which, I've got a little surprise for Alex that I think will close this chapter of my life for good. A couple of days later, I received a call from Alex that I had been half expecting, half dreading. He sounded desperate and defeated, a far cry from the competent man who had handed me divorce papers. Ella, I received the documents from you. He started, his voice shaky. I can't believe it. Liza's child. I'm not the father? His voice cracked with the question. You're not surprised? You shouldn't be. You know what kind of person she is, I replied, my words deliberate and cold. There was a heavy silence before he continued. Ella, she's gone. I kicked her and her father out. It's been hell. Can we forget all this? Start over? I need you, Ella, he pleaded. The words might have tugged at my heartstrings once, but that time was long gone. Alex, you don't need me. You need a caretaker and a way to pay your debts. I'm not falling for that again. Take care of yourself, I said firmly before hanging up the phone. Sitting back in my chair, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The last tie to a painful past had been cut, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe freely. I'm Tiffany, and 10 years ago, I was a bright-eyed tour guide with dreams of exploring the world. That all changed when I met Jack. Jack was charming, successful, and swept me off my feet. We married quickly, and I thought I had it all. Then came the job offer that would change everything. Tiff, I've been offered a position with an amazing law firm, Jack said one night over dinner. That's great, honey. Where? It's in another city. We'd have to move. My heart sank. I loved my job, but I loved Jack more. What about my work? Jack's face hardened. Come on, Tiff. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You can find work anywhere. I hesitated, but his excitement was contagious. You're right. We'll make it work. We moved to a big house in a new city. At first, it was exciting. But as the boxes were unpacked, so was a new version of Jack I'd never seen before. The house is a mess, he snapped one day, looking around our half-unpacked living room. I'm working on it, I said, gesturing to the boxes. Work faster. I can't live like this. I was taken aback, but brushed it off. He was under stress from the new job, I told myself. Weeks passed, and I struggled to find work. Maybe I should look for a tour guide position here, I suggested one evening. Jack laughed. Don't be ridiculous. You need to focus on the house. It's still not up to par. But I want to work, Jack. I miss it. He stood up, towering over me. I'm the one working, Tiffany. Your job is here, making sure everything is perfect for me. Got it? I nodded, fighting back tears. This wasn't the man I married, but I was determined to make it work. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would last for years. As the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, I found myself trapped in a routine of endless housework and walking on eggshells. Jack's demands grew more unreasonable, and his temper shorter. One day, I suggested hiring a housekeeper to help with the workload. Jack's face turned red. Are you kidding me? You want to waste my hard-earned money on something you should be doing? This is your job, Tiffany. If you can't handle it, maybe you're not cut out to be my wife. His words stung, but I swallowed my pride. You're right, I'm sorry. I'll try harder. And try harder I did. I threw myself into being the perfect housewife, hoping it would bring back the man I fell in love with. But the more I did, the more Jack expected. As his career soared, our relationship plummeted. I watched from the sidelines as he became a celebrated lawyer, all while I faded into the background, a ghost in my own home. As the years passed, I became a master of social media management, running Jack's accounts from behind the scenes. It was ironic, I crafted the image of a successful, happy couple while living a lie. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Jack stormed in, slamming the door. "Rough day?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Shut up and get my food ready," he snapped. I quickly plated the meal I'd spent hours preparing. Jack took one bite and spat it out. "This is disgusting. Can't you do anything right?" Before I could respond, he swept the plate off the table. It shattered on the floor, food splattering everywhere. "Clean it up," he growled, standing over me as I knelt to pick up the broken pieces. Tears stung my eyes, but I didn't dare let them fall. This had become our new normal. The next day, determined to do better, I spent hours cooking Jack's favorite dish. As I set the table, I realized with horror that I'd forgotten the bread. Jack walked in, loosening his tie. "Where's my food?" "Coming right up," I said, hurrying to serve the soup. He sat down, looked at the table, and exploded. "Where's the bread? Are you really this incompetent?" In one swift motion, he knocked the bowl off the table. Hot soup splashed across my leg, and I couldn't hold back a scream of pain. "God, you're so stupid," Jack muttered, leaving me alone with the mess and my burning skin. As I cleaned, sobbing quietly, a thought hit me like a thunderbolt. How did I let it get this bad? When did I become this shell of a person? The next morning, I woke up with a resolve I hadn't felt in years. I couldn't live like this anymore. "Jack," I said as he was about to leave for work, "I can't do this anymore. I want a divorce." He turned slowly, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "A divorce? You?" He laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "Listen carefully, Tiffany. If you leave me, I'll destroy you. You'll have nothing, no money, no reputation, nothing. You'll end up on the streets with the other worthless people." My breath caught in my throat. I'd seen the homeless in our city, their desperate faces haunting me. Could that really be my fate? "Face it," Jack continued, "you're nothing without me. Remember that." As he left, slamming the door behind him, I sank to the floor. He was right, I had no money of my own, no career, nothing. But I also knew I couldn't keep living like this. That day marked a turning point. I might not have had the courage to leave yet, but I started planning. I began secretly recording our interactions, saving abusive texts, and documenting everything. If I was going to escape, I needed proof. As I continued to document Jack's abuse, his career reached new heights. He won a high-profile case, and decided to celebrate at home with colleagues and friends. "You'll prepare everything," he ordered. "And don't even think about ordering in. I want it all homemade." For days, I worked tirelessly. I cleaned every inch of our house, prepared an array of dishes, and made sure everything was perfect. The night of the party arrived, and I was exhausted but ready. Jack came home early, carrying a bottle of wine. "Here," he said, pouring me a glass. "You look like you could use this." I was surprised by his gesture, but accepted gratefully. The wine tasted odd, but I chalked it up to my fatigue. Jack barely touched his glass. "Go change," he said. "Guests will be here soon." I headed upstairs, suddenly feeling dizzy. By the time I reached our bedroom, the room was spinning. I collapsed onto the bed, consciousness fading fast. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through the windows. Confused and groggy, I made my way downstairs. Jack's mother, Margaret, was in the kitchen. Her face contorted with disgust when she saw me. "Well, look who finally decided to grace us with her presence," she sneered. "You should be ashamed of yourself." What happened?" I asked, my head pounding. "What happened? You got drunk and embarrassed my son in front of all his colleagues, that's what happened." Margaret's voice rose with each word. He had to call me to help entertain because his wife was passed out drunk upstairs. I felt sick. No, that's not possible. I only had one glass of wine. Oh, save it, Margaret cut me off. I always knew you weren't good enough for my Jack. Now everyone knows what a mess you are. As Margaret continued her tirade, fragments of memory surfaced. The strange taste of the wine. Jack barely drinking his. The sudden onset of dizziness. He drugged me, I whispered to myself, the realization hitting me like a truck. After Margaret left, I sat at the kitchen table, my mind racing. Jack was systematically destroying my reputation. If I tried to leave now, who would believe me? That day, I stepped up my efforts. I bought a new phone and hid it carefully. I started recording everything, Jack's drunken rants, his 3 a.m. cleaning demands, every insult and threat. One incident I recorded stood out painfully in my memory. It was my birthday, and I had hoped Jack might remember, might show a glimmer of the man I once loved. I prepared a special dinner, holding on to a foolish hope for a peaceful evening. Jack stumbled in late, reeking of alcohol. I hit record on my hidden phone as he entered the kitchen. "What's all this?" he slurred, eyeing the carefully set table. It's my birthday, Jack. I made dinner," I said softly. He laughed, a cruel, harsh sound. "Your birthday? Who cares? Look at you, you fat cow. You don't deserve a celebration." I felt each word like a physical blow, but kept the camera rolling as he continued his tirade. "And this?" he gestured at the food. "This is slop. You call yourself a wife? Can't even cook a decent meal." He swept the plates off the table, food splattering across the floor I'd scrubbed meticulously earlier. I flinched but didn't move, letting the camera capture every moment of his drunken cruelty. Another night, the recording caught an even more bizarre incident. It was 3 a.m. when Jack shook me awake roughly. "Get up," he hissed, pulling me out of bed. "What's wrong?" I asked, disoriented and frightened. "I found dust. The house is filthy. Clean it. All of it. Now." For hours, I scrubbed every surface of our home, Jack following behind, inspecting my work with a critical eye. All the while, my phone recorded from its hidden spot, capturing his relentless demands and my exhausted compliance. These recordings became my secret weapons, concrete evidence of the abuse I endured. Each file was carefully saved and backed up, a digital archive of my suffering and, ultimately, my path to freedom. Meanwhile, I heard the whispers when we were out. Saw the looks of contempt from Jack's friends. But I kept smiling, playing the role of the perfect wife while secretly fighting for my freedom. Our wedding anniversary was approaching. Despite everything, a small part of me hoped things might improve. But I should have known better. The night of our anniversary, Jack came home in high spirits. "I booked us a table at the best restaurant in town," he announced. "Let's celebrate." I was wary, but agreed. Before we left, Jack handed me a glass of lemonade. "I made it myself," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Alarm bells rang in my head. I pretended to drink, but when Jack stepped out to make a call, I quickly poured it into a nearby plant. As we drove to the restaurant, I felt myself getting drowsy. I fought to stay awake, but my eyes were so heavy. The next thing I knew, I was being roughly pulled from the car. Through half-closed eyes, I saw Jack sneering down at me. "This is where you belong," he spat, throwing my purse far into the darkness. "With the other worthless people." I heard the car door slam, tires screeching as Jack sped away. My heart raced as I took in my surroundings. Trash littered the streets, and shadowy figures lurked in the darkness. The sound of distant gunshots made me flinch. I was alone, dressed up and wearing jewelry, in the most dangerous part of town. Jack's plan was clear. He hoped I'd fall victim to the criminals who called this area home. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to think. I spotted a small convenience store, its flickering neon sign a beacon of hope in this desolate place. I ran towards it, my heels clacking on the cracked pavement. Bursting through the door, I startled the woman behind the counter. "Please," I gasped, "I need help. Can I use your phone?" The woman, her name tag read Rosa, looked at me with a mix of concern and suspicion. "What happened to you, honey?" In a rush, I explained my situation. Rosa's eyes widened, and without a word, she locked the store's front door. "Can't have any troublemakers coming in," she explained, handing me her cell phone. "Make your call, sweetie. You're safe here." With shaking hands, I dialed my friend Sarah's number, silently thanking my good memory. Sarah answered on the third ring. "Sarah, it's Tiffany. I need help," I said, my voice breaking. "Tiff? What's wrong? Where are you?" I gave her the store's address, and she gasped. "That's the worst neighborhood in the city." "What are you doing there?" "Jack, he left me here. Please, can you come get me?" "I'm on my way. Don't move." As I waited, Rosa kept me company, her kindness a stark contrast to the cruelty I'd become accustomed to. "Thank you," I said as Sarah's car pulled up outside. "You may have saved my life tonight." I slipped off the expensive ring Jack had given me years ago. "Here, please take this." "It's not much, but..." Rosa shook her head. "Keep it, honey. Use it to start your new life." Tears in my eyes, I hugged her before rushing out to Sarah's car. As we drove away, Sarah turned to me. "Tiff, this has to stop. You need to fight back." "How?" I asked, feeling defeated. "He has all the power, all the connections." "Not all of them," Sarah said firmly. "I have a friend who works in television. It's time to tell your story." The next few days were a whirlwind. Sarah's friend, a producer named Lisa, arranged for me to appear on a popular talk show. The lights were blinding as I walked onto the set. The host, a kind-faced woman named Angela, greeted me warmly. "Tiffany, thank you for being here," she said. "Can you tell us your story?" Taking a deep breath, I began to speak. I told them everything: the years of emotional abuse, the manipulation, the incident in the bad neighborhood. As I spoke, I saw the shock and sympathy on the audience's faces. "Why are you coming forward now?" Angela asked. "Because I can't be silent anymore," I replied, my voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. "There are so many women out there suffering in silence, thinking they're alone. I want them to know they're not." As the show ended, my phone exploded with notifications. My story had struck a chord, and people were rallying behind me. But amidst the supportive messages, one text made my blood run cold. It was from Jack. "You'll regret this, you lying scum. I'll destroy you." I showed the message to Sarah, my hands shaking. "Don't worry," she said, a determined glint in her eye. "He just made his biggest mistake. We've got him now." As we left the studio, I realized this was just the beginning. The real battle was about to start, and for the first time in years, I felt ready to fight. The days following my TV appearance were a blur of activity. My phone rang constantly with calls from journalists, lawyers, and women's rights advocates. Jack's threats continued, but each one only strengthened my resolve. One morning, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Tiffany?" a woman's voice asked when I answered. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Amanda Reeves. I'm a lawyer, and I'd like to help you with your case." I hesitated. "I appreciate the offer, but I can't afford a lawyer." "You misunderstand," Amanda said. "My firm wants to take your case pro bono. We've been looking for a way to take down Jack Peterson for years. Your story could be the key." It turned out that Jack had made many enemies over the years. Amanda's firm represented several clients who had lost cases to him, some under suspicious circumstances. They saw my case as an opportunity to not only help me, but to expose Jack's unethical practices. I met with Amanda and her team the next day. As I shared my evidence, the recordings, the text messages, everything, their eyes widened. "This is gold," Amanda said, reviewing the files. With this, we can not only win your divorce case, but potentially get Jack disbarred. The divorce proceedings began, and Jack came out swinging. He painted a picture of me as an alcoholic, unfaithful wife who was trying to ruin his reputation out of spite. Your Honor, Jack's lawyer argued, Mrs. Peterson has a history of erratic behavior and substance abuse. These allegations are nothing more than the desperate actions of a woman trying to extort money from her hardworking husband. I watched as Jack's mother, Margaret, took the stand, tearfully recounting instances of my supposed drunken behavior, including the night of Jack's work party. She was a disgrace, Margaret sobbed. My poor son has suffered so much because of her. I felt sick listening to their lies, but Amanda squeezed my hand reassuringly. Don't worry, she whispered. We're just getting started. When it was our turn to present evidence, Amanda was ruthless. She played the recordings of Jack's abuse, showed the threatening text messages, and presented a timeline of his escalating behavior. And now, Amanda said, I'd like to call Sarah Thompson to the stand. Sarah recounted the night she picked me up from the dangerous neighborhood, her testimony corroborating my story. Objection, Jack's lawyer shouted. This is hearsay. Overruled, the judge said. Continue, Ms. Thompson. Next, Amanda called Rosa, the convenience store clerk, to testify. Rosa described my state when I entered her store that night, and how she had to lock the door for my safety. Jack's face grew redder with each testimony. I could see him seething, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. The final blow came when Amanda presented a toxicology report. Your Honor, we had Mrs. Peterson's hair tested for long-term drug exposure. The results show traces of sedatives, consistent with her account of being drugged by Mr. Peterson. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Jack leapt to his feet, shouting, She's lying. You can't believe this. Mr. Peterson, control yourself or I'll hold you in contempt, the judge warned. As the evidence mounted, I saw the change in people's faces. The doubt was replaced by shock and sympathy. Even some of Jack's friends in the gallery looked disgusted. The judge called a recess to review all the evidence. As we filed out of the courtroom, I caught Jack's eye. For the first time, I saw fear there. The courtroom was packed as we reconvened for the judge's decision. The tension was palpable, and I could feel Jack's glare burning into the back of my head. Judge Harris cleared his throat. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, this court finds in favor of Mrs. Tiffany Peterson. A collective gasp filled the room. I sat there, stunned, as the judge continued. Mr. Jack Peterson is hereby ordered to pay alimony, surrender 50% of all joint property, and provide financial compensation for emotional damages. Furthermore, Mr. Peterson will cover all legal costs associated with this case. Jack exploded. This is outrageous. I'll appeal. You can't do this to me. Mr. Peterson, the judge's voice boomed, I suggest you control yourself. Given the evidence presented, you should consider yourself lucky that criminal charges haven't been filed. As Jack was forcibly calmed by his lawyer, the judge turned to me. Mrs. Peterson, this court is imposing a restraining order against Mr. Peterson. He is not to approach you or contact you through any means. Do you understand? I nodded, tears of relief streaming down my face. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. I moved out of the house I had once considered a prison, into a small but cozy apartment. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. But Jack wasn't done. Despite the restraining order, he found ways to make his presence felt. Mutual acquaintances would relay his threats, and I'd occasionally spot his car driving by my new place. We need to do something, Sarah said one evening as we were having coffee. He's not going to stop. I nodded, an idea forming. You're right. And I think I know how to end this once and for all. I still had access to Jack's social media accounts. He'd been too arrogant to change the passwords, probably assuming I wouldn't dare touch them. It was time to use that against him. Over the next few days, I meticulously documented our entire divorce process on his accounts. I shared court transcripts, audio clips, and my own story. The response was overwhelming. Jack's carefully crafted public image crumbled overnight. His firm, unwilling to be associated with the scandal, asked for his resignation. Clients dropped him in droves. When Jack realized what was happening, he went ballistic. He showed up at my apartment, pounding on the door. "You scum," he screamed. "I'll kill you for this." I called the police, and they arrived quickly. Jack was arrested for violating the restraining order. His threats caught on my phone's voice recorder. As they led him away, I saw the man I had once loved, now a shell of himself, broken by his own cruelty and arrogance. In the following months, I heard through the grapevine that Jack had moved to another state, trying to rebuild his career. But his reputation followed him, and he struggled to find work. As for me, I was rebuilding too, but in a much different way. The publicity from the case led to an opportunity one never expected. A local charity that helped women escape abusive relationships reached out to me. "We'd like you to come work with us," the director said. "Your experience could help so many women." I accepted without hesitation. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a purpose. I was using my pain to help others, and in doing so, I was healing myself. 1 year after the trial, I stood in front of a room full of women, all survivors like me. As I shared my story, I saw hope rekindling in their eyes. "Remember," I told them, "you are stronger than you know. Your story matters. And you are not alone." As I looked out at their faces, I realized that this moment, this purpose, was what I had been fighting for all along. Not just my freedom, but the chance to help others find theirs. As months passed, my work at the charity became more than just a job, it became my calling. I found myself connecting with women from all walks of life, each with their own harrowing stories of abuse and survival. One day, a young woman named Emily came to our center. Her story was painfully familiar: a controlling husband, isolation from friends and family, and a deep-seated fear of leaving. Over the next few weeks, I worked closely with Emily, helping her create a safety plan and build up her confidence. When she finally left her husband, the look of relief on her face was all too familiar. "Thank you," she whispered, hugging me tightly. "You saved my life." Her words hit me hard. In helping her, I realized I was also continuing to heal myself. As our center's reputation grew, we started receiving invitations to speak at conferences and events. At first, the idea terrified me. Public speaking had never been my forte, and the thought of sharing my story with large audiences made my palms sweat. But Sarah, ever my rock, encouraged me. "Tiff, your story could help so many people. You've got to do this." My first speaking engagement was at a local university. As I stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, I felt a surge of strength I didn't know I possessed. "My name is Tiffany," I began, "and this is my story of survival." As I spoke, I saw the impact my words were having. Students leaned forward in their seats, some wiping away tears, others nodding in understanding or clenching their fists in anger at what I'd endured. After the talk, a line of people formed to speak with me. Many shared their own experiences or those of loved ones. Others simply wanted to offer support. That night, as I lay in bed reflecting on the day, I felt a profound sense of purpose. My past, painful as it was, had become a tool for change. The speaking engagements continued, taking me across the country. I spoke at universities, women's shelters, and even a TEDx event. Each time, I drew strength from the audience, from the knowledge that my words might be the lifeline someone needed. During this time, I also started writing a book about my experiences. It was a grueling process, forcing me to relive some of my darkest moments. But it was also cathartic, allowing me to process my trauma in a new way. The day my book was published was surreal. Seeing my name on the cover, my story laid bare for the world to read, filled me with a mix of terror and pride. To my amazement, the book resonated with people. It climbed the bestseller lists, and I soon found myself doing interviews on national television. During one such interview, the host asked me a question that made me pause. "Tiffany, after everything you've been through, do you have any regrets?" I thought for a moment before answering. I regret the years I lost to fear and abuse. But I don't regret my journey. Every step, every struggle, led me to where I am now, able to help others find their strength. So no, I wouldn't change a thing. As I continued my work, I realized that my story was far from over. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities to grow and to help others. The scared, silenced woman I once was had become a voice for the voiceless, a beacon of hope for those still trapped in the darkness I had escaped. I'm Amanda Pierce, 32 years old, born and raised in Miami. My life revolves around gems and jewelry, just like my parents and grandparents did. Pierce Gems, our family's boutique jewelry store, sits pretty in Miami's fancy shopping district. It's not just a store, it's my whole world. Growing up, I spent more time in the workshop than I did in playgrounds. While other kids were learning to ride bikes, I was learning to cut stones. My dad would sit me on his lap, his big, calloused hands guiding my smaller ones as we worked on a piece together. "Remember, Mandy," he'd say, his voice gruff but kind, "it's not just about making something pretty. It's about creating something that tells a story. Our family has a secret. No, we're not secretly royalty or anything like that. It's a technique for processing gems that makes them shine like nothing you've ever seen. This secret's been passed down for 3 generations, and it's what makes Pierce Gems special. Guard this secret with your life, Amanda," my dad told me on my 21st birthday. "It's not just our past, it's our future." And I did. I guarded it fiercely. It was my responsibility, my burden, and my ticket to success in a world that often didn't take a young woman seriously. Pierce Gems wasn't just successful, it was thriving. We had a loyal clientele who appreciated the unique brilliance of our pieces. Other jewelers tried to figure out our secret, but none came close. The Gemstone Society's annual gala was always a glitzy affair, but that year, it felt different. Maybe it was the champagne, or maybe it was the way my new emerald dress hugged my curves, but I felt electric that night. I made my way through the crowd, nodding at familiar faces and exchanging pleasantries. The room was a sea of designer gowns and tailored suits, everyone dripping in jewels that probably cost more than my first car. "Amanda, darling, you look fabulous," gushed Marjorie, one of our regular clients. She grabbed my hands, her eyes zeroing in on the ring I was wearing. "Is this one of your new pieces? It's stunning." I smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "Just finished it last week. It's part of our new Midnight Sky collection." "I simply must have one," Marjorie declared. "I'll stop by the shop next week." As she fluttered off to gossip with her friends, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned around and found myself face to face with the most captivating pair of blue eyes I'd ever seen. "Excuse me," said the owner of those eyes, flashing a smile that could melt ice. I couldn't help but overhear. "You're Amanda Pierce, aren't you?" I nodded, suddenly feeling tongue-tied. "That's me. And you are?" "Jason Randfield," he replied, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you. I've heard great things about your work." Randfield. The name hit me like a ton of bricks. The Randfields were jewelry royalty, owners of one of the largest jewelry empires in the country. And here was their heir, talking to me like I was the most interesting person in the room. "The pleasure's all mine," I managed to say, shaking his hand. I didn't realize the Randfields would be here tonight. Jason laughed, a rich, warm sound that made me feel like we were sharing an inside joke. "We usually skip these events, but I insisted on coming this year. I've been following your work, Amanda. You're making waves in the industry." I felt a blush creep up my cheeks. "That's very kind of you to say." "It's the truth," he said, his eyes twinkling. "In fact, I was hoping we could discuss a potential collaboration. How about dinner next week?" My heart skipped a beat. A collaboration with the Rand Fields could take Pierce Gems to the next level. But a small voice in the back of my head whispered a warning. The Rand Fields were our biggest competitors. Could they be trusted? I pushed the thought aside. This was business, nothing more. Dinner sounds great, I heard myself say. Jason's smile widened. Excellent. I'll have my assistant set it up. He glanced over my shoulder and frowned slightly. I'm afraid I have to mingle, but I'm looking forward to our dinner, Amanda. As he walked away, I felt like I was floating. Jason Randfield had sought me out. Me, Amanda Pierce, the girl who spent more time with gems than people. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I danced, I laughed, I networked. But my mind kept drifting back to those blue eyes and that dazzling smile. Jason had chosen a trendy restaurant in South Beach, the kind of place where the who's who of Miami came to see and be seen. As I walked in, I spotted him immediately, looking impossibly handsome in a tailored suit. He stood up as I approached, his eyes lighting up. Amanda, he said, taking my hand. You look stunning. I felt a flutter in my stomach, but pushed it down. Thank you, Jason. You clean up pretty well yourself. As we sipped our wine, the conversation flowed easily. We talked about our shared passion for jewelry, swapping stories about difficult clients and challenging designs. I found myself relaxing, drawn in by Jason's wit and charm. So, I said, as our main courses arrived. You mentioned a potential collaboration at the gala. What did you have in mind? Jason leaned forward, his eyes sparkling with excitement. I've been following your work for a while now, Amanda. The way you bring out the brilliance in gems, it's unlike anything I've seen before. I think a partnership between Pierce Gems and Randfield Jewelry could revolutionize the industry. I raised an eyebrow. That's a bold statement. How exactly would this partnership work? We have the resources and the reach, Jason explained. You have the skill and the innovation. Together, we could create a line that combines the best of both our worlds. It sounded tempting, I had to admit. But years of protecting our family secret made me cautious. And what about our individual techniques? Our trade secrets? Jason held up his hands. Those would remain separate, of course. This would be about combining our strengths, not revealing our secrets. I nodded slowly, turning the idea over in my mind. It's an interesting proposition. I'd need to think about it, discuss it with my team. Of course, Jason said, his smile understanding. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. As dinner progressed, our conversation drifted from business to more personal topics. Jason told me about growing up in the shadow of the Randfield Empire, the pressure to live up to his family name. I found myself opening up about my own experiences, the weight of carrying on the Pierce legacy. Before I knew it, we were seeing each other regularly. Jason swept me off my feet with grand gestures and intimate moments. One weekend, he surprised me with a spontaneous trip to the Bahamas. Pack a bag, he said, showing up at my door with a mischievous grin. We're going on an adventure. I hesitated, thinking about the orders I needed to fill. Jason, I can't just leave. I have work. He silenced me with a kiss. The work will be there when you get back. When's the last time you took a break, Amanda? I couldn't remember, and that realization made me pause. Maybe he was right. Maybe I did need a break. The Bahamas were like a dream. We spent our days lounging on pristine beaches, snorkeling in crystal clear waters, and our nights dancing under the stars. It was intoxicating, being the center of Jason's attention. Back in Miami, our relationship continued to blossom. Jason would surprise me with rare orchids flown in from Thailand, their delicate petals reminding me of his thoughtfulness. We'd spend evenings at fancy restaurants or quiet nights in, talking for hours about everything and nothing. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The first time Jason took me to meet his parents, I felt like I'd stepped into a lion's den. Vivian Randfield, Jason's mother, looked me up and down with barely concealed disdain. "So, you're the little jeweler Jason's been spending so much time with," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I straightened my spine, meeting her gaze. "That's right. Amanda Pierce of Pierce Gems. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Randfield." Robert Randfield, Jason's father, was a bit warmer, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. "Pierce Gems," he mused. "You've been making quite a name for yourselves lately. Impressive for such a small operation." The dinner was a minefield of backhanded compliments and thinly veiled insults. At one point, Vivian accidentally spilled her red wine on my dress. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, not sounding sorry at all. "I suppose your hands must be too rough from all that manual labor to hold delicate glassware properly." I plastered on a smile even as I seethed inside. "No worries, Mrs. Randfield. Accidents happen." Jason squeezed my hand under the table, a silent show of support. Later, as he drove me home, he apologized profusely. "I'm so sorry about my parents," he said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "They can be difficult." I sighed, looking out at the Miami skyline. "It's okay. I'm sure they're just protective of you." Jason shook his head. "It's not okay. You're important to me, Amanda. They need to accept that." His words warmed my heart, pushing away the lingering chill from his parents' cold reception. As weeks turned into months, I found myself falling harder for Jason. He was everything I'd never known I wanted: charming, worldly, and seemingly head over heels for me. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen and appreciated for more than just my craft. We'd been dating for about 8 months when he surprised me with a trip to Paris. "Pack your bags, darling," he said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "We're off to the city of love." And so I found myself in Paris, strolling hand in hand with Jason along the Seine, marveling at the architecture, and indulging in decadent French cuisine. It was like a dream. On our last night in Paris, Jason took me to dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant with a view of the Eiffel Tower. As we finished our dessert, he suddenly looked nervous. "Amanda," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. I can't imagine my life without you." He stood up, and to my shock, got down on one knee beside our table. The other diners gasped and turned to watch. "Amanda Pierce," Jason said, pulling out a small velvet box. "Will you marry me?" I stared at the ring in shock. It was beautiful, but a small part of me couldn't help but notice that it paled in comparison to my own creations. I pushed that thought aside, focusing instead on the man kneeling before me, his eyes full of hope and love. "Yes," I heard myself say. "Yes, I'll marry you." When we returned to Miami, reality came crashing back. Jason's parents insisted on throwing us an engagement party, and I found myself thrust into a world of high society that I'd only ever observed from the outside. The party was a lavish affair at the Randfield mansion. As I circulated among Miami's elite, I couldn't help but feel out of place. These people lived in a different world than I did, a world of old money and ingrained privilege. Vivian Randfield cornered me by the champagne fountain, her smile as sharp as a diamond-tipped saw. "Amanda, darling, I must say, we were all quite surprised when Jason announced your engagement. It's not often a Randfield marries outside our social circle." Before I could respond, Jason appeared at my side, placing a protective arm around my waist. "Mother, I hope you're not giving Amanda a hard time." Vivian's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course not, darling. I was just welcoming Amanda to the family." Later that night, as Jason and I slow danced under the crystal chandeliers, he leaned in close. "I have an idea," he whispered. "Why don't you make a special piece for my mother? As a peace offering. Show her what you can do." I hesitated. The Pierce family secret wasn't something I shared lightly, even with my fiancé. But maybe Jason was right. Maybe this could be a way to bridge the gap between our two worlds. The weeks following our engagement were a whirlwind of wedding planning. I threw myself into creating the perfect necklace for Vivian, hoping it would be the olive branch that could finally win her over. I spent countless hours in my workshop, pouring my heart and soul into the piece. I used rare pink diamonds and a flawless blue sapphire from my father's private collection. It was to be my masterpiece, a testament to my skill and the Pierce family secret. One evening, as I was putting the finishing touches on the clasp, Jason stopped by the workshop. His eyes widened. "Amanda, it's incredible. I've never seen anything like it." I felt a surge of pride. "Do you think your mother will like it?" Jason nodded, his eyes still fixed on the necklace. "She'd be a fool not to. The way it catches the light, it's almost otherworldly." I smiled, pleased with his reaction. That's the Pierce touch. The next week, I was at the Randfield mansion for another wedding planning session. Suddenly, I heard raised voices coming from down the hall. I slipped out of the room and followed the sound of the voices. As I got closer, I could make out what they were saying. "You're being ridiculous, Jason," came Robert's deep voice. "This marriage is a golden opportunity. Don't tell me you're getting cold feet now." "It's not like that," Jason protested. But nothing," Vivian's shrill voice cut in. "You've done well, darling. She's eating out of the palm of your hand. Soon, we'll have everything we need." I edged closer to the partially open door, my heart pounding in my chest. Through the crack, I could see Jason pacing back and forth, sipping wine from a glass. "You should see how eagerly she's making that necklace," he said, and I felt my world tilt on its axis. "She has no idea she's handing over the keys to her entire legacy." Vivian's laugh pierced the air like a knife. "And to think, we almost objected to you marrying that little nobody. I must say, Jason, your acting skills have improved tremendously. She actually believes you love her." I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a gasp. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a mistake. But Robert's next words shattered any lingering doubt. "Once we have the Pierce secret, we'll corner the market," he said, his voice filled with smug satisfaction. "Who cares if her quaint little shop goes under? It's just business, after all." I felt like I was going to be sick. My vision blurred with unshed tears as the full weight of their betrayal hit me. Jason, the man I thought I loved, the man I had agreed to marry, had been using me all along. The days following my shocking discovery were a blur of emotions and careful planning. On the surface, I played the part of the excited bride-to-be perfectly. I gushed over flower arrangements, fretted about seating charts, and continued work on Vivian's necklace. But inside, I was seething with rage and plotting my revenge. "How's the necklace coming along, darling?" Jason asked one evening, wrapping his arms around me from behind as I worked in my studio. I fought the urge to flinch away from his touch. "Almost done," I replied, forcing a smile. "Your mother is going to love it." Late into the night, after Jason had gone home, I began creating a new collection. Each piece was a work of art, telling the story of betrayal through intricate designs and carefully chosen gems. But jewelry wasn't my only focus. One day, I broke into Jason's home computer and downloaded all the files I could find. I spent hours poring over the Randfield Company documents, looking for any discrepancies or signs of wrongdoing. It was tedious work, but my determination fueled me. One night, as I was going through a stack of financial reports, something caught my eye. The Randfields had been systematically replacing high-quality gems with cheaper alternatives in their jewelry, scamming their customers out of millions. The next challenge was gathering evidence of their plot against me. I bought a small, high-quality recording device and began carrying it with me everywhere. It felt dirty, but I reminded myself that they had started this game. I was just finishing it. As the final week before the wedding arrived, I put the finishing touches on my plan. I had evidence of the Randfields' gem scam, recordings of their plot against me, and a collection that would shock Miami's elite to its core. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a perfect Miami day. As I arrived at the beachfront venue, my heart was pounding, but my resolve was firm. I clutched my velvet-lined case, containing my new collection and all the evidence I'd gathered, like a lifeline. "Amanda! There you are!" Jason's best man, Mark, called out as I entered. "Everyone's been looking for you. Are you ready?" I gave him a tight smile. "More ready than you know." As I was ushered into a private room to wait, I could hear the murmur of guests arriving outside. Miami's elite, all gathered to witness what they thought would be the society wedding of the year. If only they knew. The wedding march began to play, and I started my walk down the aisle. Faces turned to watch me, smiling and expectant. I saw Vivian and Robert in the front row, looking smug and satisfied. Jason waited at the altar, beaming at me. But as I reached the altar, instead of taking Jason's hand, I turned to face the assembled guests. "I'm afraid there won't be a wedding today," I announced, my voice clear and strong. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Jason's face contorted in confusion. "Amanda, what are you doing?" I ignored him, addressing the guests instead. "Instead, I'll be unveiling my newest collection, The Art of Betrayal." With that, I opened my case and began to pull out the pieces one by one, explaining the symbolism behind each one. The snake bracelet, representing deceit. The shattered diamond ring, symbolizing broken trust. The color-changing teardrop earrings, reflecting the shifting nature of lies. As I spoke, I saw understanding and horror dawn on the Randfields' faces. But I wasn't done yet. "And for the grand finale," I said, pulling out Vivian's necklace. "A special commission with a hidden message." I held it up to the light, revealing the word liar spelled out in pink diamonds. The crowd gasped again, this time in a mix of shock and admiration. "Amanda, stop this nonsense right now," Robert Randfield bellowed, his face red with anger. But I was beyond stopping. I pulled out the documents I'd gathered, the recordings I'd made. "The Randfields aren't just liars in love," I announced. "They're liars in business too." I proceeded to lay out the evidence of their gem scam, playing recordings of their plot against me and Pierce Gems. With each revelation, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, shocked faces turning to the Randfields for explanation. "This is preposterous," Vivian shrieked, but her voice was shaking. As security began to escort the sputtering Randfields out, I addressed the crowd one final time. "I stand before you not as a bride, but as a businesswoman protecting her legacy. Pierce Gems will continue to create beauty and brilliance, without compromising our integrity." The aftermath was chaos. Reporters who had come to cover a society wedding found themselves with a much bigger story. Photos of my triumphant face and stunning jewelry splashed across social media and magazines worldwide. In the days following what the press dubbed the wedding that wasn't, my life became a whirlwind of interviews, legal meetings, and damage control. The story had exploded beyond Miami, capturing national attention. My phone rang nonstop with calls from reporters, industry insiders, and even a few Hollywood producers interested in my story. I sat in my workshop, surrounded by half-finished pieces and stacks of newspapers, all featuring my face on the front page. The headlines ranged from "Jewel of Deception, Heiress Exposes $1 Million Scam" to "Love, Lies, and Luxury, the Pierce Randfield Saga." The Randfield empire crumbled under the weight of the scandal, with multiple lawsuits filed against them. My best friend and now lawyer, Sarah, burst through the door, her arms full of more newspapers and legal documents. "Amanda," she said, dropping everything on my workbench. "We need to talk strategy. The press is having a field day, and we've got at least a dozen interview requests." Over the next few weeks, I carefully chose which interviews to give. I spoke about the importance of transparency in the jewelry business, the need for stricter regulations, and my vision for a more ethical industry. As the weeks turned into months, the media frenzy began to die down, but my resolve only grew stronger. I channeled my energy into Pierce Gems, pushing myself to create more innovative designs while maintaining our commitment to ethical sourcing. One evening, as I was locking up the shop, a woman approached me. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. "Ms. Pierce," she said hesitantly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to thank you." I tilted my head, confused. Thank me? For what? She smiled sadly. I bought a Randfield piece for my 25th wedding anniversary. After your exposé, I had it appraised. Turns out, the stone wasn't nearly what they claimed it was. Thanks to you, I was able to get my money back. I felt a lump form in my throat. I'm glad I could help. As she walked away, I realized that my actions had affected real people, not just faceless consumers. The scandal that had nearly destroyed me had instead become the catalyst for positive change. And I, Amanda Pierce, was just getting started. I'm Natalie, and at 35, I thought I had my life figured out. As an interior designer, I poured my heart and soul into transforming spaces. My small apartment was my sanctuary, a place where I could retreat from the world and just be myself. Losing my parents early on wasn't easy, but it taught me to be self-reliant. I got used to the quiet evenings, the solitude that comes with being alone. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't some hermit hiding from the world. I had friends, colleagues, and a career I loved. But serious relationships? They weren't on my radar. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, I flopped onto my couch and started scrolling through my social media. It was a mindless habit, one that helped me unwind. That's when I saw the message. Hey there, Natalie. Your designs are incredible. Have you ever thought about doing commercial spaces? I paused, my thumb hovering over the screen. The profile picture showed a handsome guy with a warm smile. Jake Thompson, 38, business owner. I hesitated for a moment before replying. Thanks, Jake. I've done a few commercial projects, but I mostly focus on residential spaces. Why do you ask? And just like that, we started chatting. At first, it was all business. He owned a small transportation company and was thinking about revamping his office. But as the days went by, our conversations drifted to other topics. Movies, books, our favorite spots in the city. It was easy, effortless. A week into our chats, Jake threw me a curveball. Natalie, I've really enjoyed talking to you. Would you like to grab coffee sometime? No pressure, just thought it'd be nice to meet in person. I stared at the message, my heart doing a little flip. Sure, why not? There's a great little cafe near my office. How about Saturday at 2? Saturday rolled around, and I found myself standing in front of my closet, suddenly aware of how much of my wardrobe consisted of work clothes. I settled on a casual sundress, something that said I made an effort, but I'm not trying too hard. The cafe was buzzing when I arrived. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on Jake. He was even more handsome in person, with kind eyes and an easy smile. He stood up when he saw me, waving me over. Natalie, it's great to finally meet you, he said, his voice warm and genuine. Likewise, I replied, sliding into the seat across from him. I hope you haven't been waiting long. And just like that, we fell into conversation. Jake was attentive, asking thoughtful questions about my work. He told me about his transportation company, the challenges of managing a fleet of trucks and drivers. Time flew by, and before I knew it, we'd been talking for hours. As we left the cafe, Jake turned to me. I had a great time, Natalie. Would you like to do this again sometime? I found myself nodding before I even realized it. Yeah, I'd like that. Over the next few weeks, Jake and I started seeing each other regularly. Our coffee dates turned into dinners, and soon we were spending most of our free time together. There was something about Jake that made me feel at ease. He was competent without being arrogant, smart without being condescending. As the months passed, our relationship deepened. Jake introduced me to his mother, Sarah, a kind woman in her 60s who had recently suffered a stroke. She lived with Jake in a modest house on the outskirts of town. Mom, this is Natalie, Jake said, his arm around my waist. Sarah's face lit up. Oh, Jake's told me so much about you. Come in, come in. Despite her condition, Sarah was warm and welcoming. We spent the afternoon chatting, and I found myself growing fond of her. It was clear that Jake was devoted to his mother, and seeing this softer side of him made me fall for him even more. As we were leaving, Sarah pulled me aside. "You're good for him, Natalie. I haven't seen Jake this happy in years." Her words stayed with me, warming my heart. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself. Our relationship wasn't without its challenges. Jake's work often kept him busy, and there were times when I felt like I was competing with his company for attention. But he always made time for me, surprising me with lunch dates or leaving sweet notes in my apartment. A year flew by in a whirlwind of love and laughter. On our anniversary, Jake took me to the same cafe where we had our first date. As we finished our meal, he reached across the table and took my hand. "Natalie," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "This past year has been the best of my life. You brought so much joy and love into my world. I can't imagine my life without you." My breath caught in my throat as he got down on one knee, pulling out a small velvet box. "Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded, unable to speak. Jake slipped the ring onto my finger, and the cafe erupted in applause. As we left, hand in hand, I couldn't stop staring at the ring. It was beautiful, but more than that, it represented a future I never thought I'd have. We decided to have a small wedding, just close friends and family. Sarah was overjoyed, insisting on helping with the planning, despite her health issues. The day of the wedding was perfect. As I walked down the aisle, seeing Jake's face light up, I knew I had made the right decision. We exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other through whatever life threw our way. At the reception, Sarah pulled me aside, her eyes glistening with tears. "Welcome to the family, dear," she said, hugging me tightly. After the wedding, Jake and I decided to move into Sarah's house. It made sense, she needed care, and the house was spacious enough for all of us. I rented out my apartment, packing up my life into cardboard boxes, with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The first few months of marriage were blissful. Jake was attentive and loving, always ready with a kiss or a kind word. Sarah and I grew closer, bonding over our shared love of gardening and cooking. It felt like I had gained not just a husband, but a mother as well. Determined to help Sarah recover from her stroke, I hired a massage therapist and a therapeutic gymnastics coach. The improvements were slow, but steady. Within a few months, Sarah was walking normally, even starting to putter around in the garden and cook meals. As for Jake and me, we were in no rush to have children. We both wanted to focus on our careers and enjoy our time together. But as our first wedding anniversary approached, I noticed a subtle shift in Jake's behavior. He started staying late at work more often, citing issues with drivers or last-minute client requests. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, running a business wasn't easy, and I often worked late hours myself. One Saturday morning, as I was enjoying my coffee and a good book, Jake announced he had to go into the office. "On a weekend?" I asked, surprised. He shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "Yeah, some paperwork I need to catch up on. Don't wait up for me, okay?" As he left, I felt a twinge of unease. But I pushed it aside, focusing instead on my plans for the day. It was Sarah who first voiced her concerns. We were in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she broached the subject. "Natalie, dear," she began, her voice hesitant. "Have you noticed Jake's been working a lot lately? You should keep an eye on him, you know. Don't let him take you for granted." I turned to her, surprised. "What do you mean?" She sighed, looking suddenly older. "Men, sometimes they get restless. They forget what they have at home." Her words sent a chill through me. Was she speaking from experience? I wanted to ask, but something in her expression held me back. That night, as I lay in bed waiting for Jake to come home, Sarah's words echoed in my mind. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that something might be wrong. When Jake finally crawled into bed in the early hours of the morning, I pretended to be asleep. He smelled of cigarette smoke and, was that perfume? My stomach churned, but I kept my eyes closed, my breathing steady. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't live with this uncertainty, this growing doubt. I needed to know the truth, whatever it might be. With shaking hands, I picked up my phone and searched for private investigators in our area. It felt wrong, a betrayal of trust, but the alternative, living with this gnawing suspicion, seemed worse. I found a highly rated agency and made an appointment for later that week. As I hung up, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Soon, I told myself, I would have answers. Whether I would like those answers was another matter entirely. The detective's office was small and cluttered, with files stacked haphazardly on every surface. The detective himself, a grizzled man in his 50s, introduced himself as Mike. I laid out everything, the late nights, the weekend work, the subtle changes in Jake's behavior. As I spoke, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. It felt good to voice my fears, to have someone listen without judgment. "All right," Mike said when I finished. "Here's what we'll do. We'll track his movements for a few weeks, see if we can establish a pattern. If he's up to something, we'll find out." 3 weeks later, my phone rang. It was Mike. "Mrs. Thompson, I think you should come to my office. I have some information for you." The drive to his office was a blur. My hand shook as I parked, and I had to take a moment to compose myself before going in. Mike was waiting for me, a thick file on his desk. His expression was grim. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson," he began, and my heart sank. "But your suspicions were correct. Your husband has been unfaithful." He pushed the file towards me. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside were photos, text messages, hotel receipts. Evidence of not one affair, but several. Jake had been seeing multiple women, juggling them with what appeared to be a carefully planned schedule. "He's been meeting them at various hotels," Mike explained gently. "Always on different days of the week. It seems he's been doing this for quite some time." I stared at the photos, unable to process what I was seeing. There was Jake, my Jake, with his arm around a blonde woman I'd never seen before. Another showed him kissing a redhead outside a restaurant. My stomach churned. I left Mike's office in a daze, the file clutched to my chest. As I drove home, tears blurred my vision. How could Jake do this to me? To us? What about our vows, our promises? When I pulled into our driveway, I saw that Jake's car wasn't there. Of course not. It was Thursday, according to Mike's report, that was his night with the blonde. Sarah was in the living room when I came in. One look at my face, and she knew. "Oh, Natalie," she said softly. "What happened?" I couldn't hold it in anymore. I collapsed onto the couch next to her and told her everything, my suspicions, hiring the detective, what I'd learned. Sarah reached out, gently taking the file from my hands and setting it aside. Her eyes, filled with a mixture of concern and determination, met mine. "You need to rest, dear. You can't make any decisions in this state. A clear mind is what you need now." I nodded numbly, allowing her to guide me to my feet and towards the stairs. As I climbed each step, I felt as though I was moving through molasses, my body heavy with the burden of my newfound knowledge. "We'll talk more tomorrow," Sarah promised as she saw me to my room. "Try to get some sleep." Sleep, however, proved elusive. I tossed and turned all night, my mind replaying every moment of my marriage, searching for clues I might have missed. When dawn finally broke, I gave up on rest and got ready for work. Work was a blur. I moved through the day on autopilot, my colleagues' concerned glances bouncing off the protective shell I'd built around myself. As the office emptied out for the evening, I remained at my desk, unable to face the thought of going home. It was dark by the time I finally left, the streets quiet as I made my way back to the house. As I turned onto our street, a strange sight greeted me. The garage door was wide open, and I could hear the rumble of an engine. Suddenly, Sarah came tearing out of the garage in Jake's pickup truck, the tires screeching as she swerved onto the street. My heart leapt into my throat as she barreled towards me, but at the last moment, she slammed on the brakes. "Natalie," she shouted, her voice sharp with urgency. "Get in the car. Now." Bewildered and alarmed by the wild look in her eyes, I obeyed without question, scrambling into the passenger seat. No sooner had I closed the door than Sarah floored the accelerator, the truck lurching forward with a roar. In the rearview mirror, I saw Jake burst out of the house, his face contorted with rage. He ran after us, shouting and cursing, but Sarah didn't slow down. We tore down the street, leaving him behind. I turned to Sarah, my heart pounding. "What's going on?" I demanded, but the words died in my throat when I saw her expression. She looked terrified, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. We drove in tense silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 30 minutes. I didn't dare speak, afraid of breaking Sarah's concentration as she navigated the darkening roads. Finally, Sarah pulled into the parking lot of a roadside diner. She scanned the area carefully before killing the engine, her body still tense. "Come on," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to talk." Inside the diner, we slid into a booth in the far corner. Sarah ordered coffee for both of us, her eyes constantly darting to the door. When the waitress left, Sarah leaned across the table, speaking in a hushed, frantic whisper. "Natalie, listen to me carefully. We're in danger. An hour ago, I overheard Jake on the phone. He was talking about getting rid of us, Natalie. Both of us." I stared at her in shock, my mind reeling from her words. The idea that Jake could be planning to get rid of us seemed too outlandish to be true. Sarah must have sensed my disbelief, because her expression shifted from fear to determination. "You don't believe me," she said, not as a question, but a statement. Without waiting for my response, she reached into her purse and pulled out Jake's phone. "I found this in his car when I was leaving. Look for yourself." Together, Sarah and I huddled over the small screen, scrolling through Jake's messages. My heart sank as we came across a conversation with someone labeled NH Director. As we read, the truth of Sarah's words became clearer. Jake wasn't planning to kill us, but his intentions were far from innocent. He was in talks with the director of a state nursing home, discussing ways to have Sarah declared incapacitated and admitted against her will. "Oh my God," I whispered, quickly searching for reviews of the nursing home. What I found made my blood run cold. Neglect, abuse, unsanitary conditions, the stories were nightmarish. I looked up at Sarah, who seemed relieved. But as I read her some of the worst accounts, Sarah's relief turned to anger. "That's not living," she spat. "It's a slow death. It might as well be murder." But Jake's betrayal didn't end there. As we continued to scroll, we found messages to multiple women, his mistresses. The sheer number was staggering, but what hurt the most were his words about me. "Once Mom's out of the way, I'll leave Natalie," one message read. "I'm tired of playing house. I want my freedom." I felt sick, but forced myself to keep reading, copying the messages to my email as evidence. Sarah and I sat in disgusted silence, the weight of Jake's betrayal hanging heavy between us. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have seen this coming," she said. "Jake's father, he cheated on me too. 4 years. He even had another family, 2 kids I didn't know about until it was too late." My jaw dropped. "Sarah, I had no idea." She nodded sadly. I turned a blind eye to it all. I loved him, and I was afraid he'd leave us if I confronted him. I thought, I hoped Jake would be different. That seeing his father's mistakes would make him a better man. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "But he's been this way since he was young. Always charming, always with a new girl on his arm. I lost count of how many hearts he broke. When he married you, Natalie, I thought he'd finally grown up. I was so happy." I took a deep breath. "I'm going to divorce him. I can't stay with someone who would do this to us." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. Then, to my surprise, she began to cry softly. "Please," she whispered, "don't leave me. I can't face this alone." Without hesitation, I moved to her side of the booth, wrapping my arms around her. "I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. We're family, and we'll get through this together. I promise." As Sarah and I sat in the diner booth, emotionally drained from our discoveries, I felt a weight pressing on my chest. There was one more piece of news I needed to share, something that complicated our situation even further. "Sarah," I began, my voice barely above a whisper, "there's something else you should know." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I'm pregnant. I found out just this morning at work. I don't know what to do." Sarah's expression hardened, a fierce determination replacing her initial shock. "I'll tell you what we're going to do," she said, her voice strong and resolute. "We're going to fight back. Jake doesn't get to destroy our lives and walk away unscathed. It's time we took control." We paid for our coffee and headed back to the truck. The drive home was tense, but filled with a sense of purpose. As we pulled into the driveway, I saw Jake's car parked haphazardly, a clear sign of his agitated state. Taking a deep breath, Sarah and I entered the house. Jake was pacing in the living room, his face contorted with rage. As soon as he saw us, he exploded. "Mom, what the hell were you thinking, taking off with my truck? And my phone? Have you lost your mind?" Before Sarah could respond, I stepped forward, my heart pounding, but my resolve firm. I held up the file from the private investigator. "Jake, we need to talk." His eyes darted from me to the file, realization dawning on his face. For a moment, he looked panicked, but then his expression smoothed into one of cool indifference. "So, you know," he said, his voice eerily calm. "What are you going to do about it, Natalie? Divorce me?" "Yes," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I want a divorce." To my shock, Jake laughed. "Come on, Natalie. You're overreacting." So I had a few flings. "It doesn't mean anything. You're not enough for me, but we can make this work. You can stay, be a good wife, and I'll be discreet with my extracurricular activities." I felt a surge of anger and disgust. "You must be joking. I don't need a Ravella like you in my life, Jake. We're done." Jake's face darkened. He pointed to the door, his voice low and menacing. "Fine. Get out. This is my house, and I want you gone." Before I could respond, Sarah stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "Actually, Jake, this is my house. I own it, and I decide who stays and who goes." She took a deep breath. "And I'm telling you to leave. Now." Jake's jaw dropped, disbelief written all over his face. "Mom, what are you saying? I'm your son. And Natalie? She's nothing to you." Sarah's grip on my hand tightened. "You're wrong, Jake. Natalie is like a daughter to me. She's family." Then, with a pointed look at me, she added, "And she's carrying my grandchild." Jake's eyes widened, darting to my stomach. For a moment, hope flickered across his face. "You're pregnant? Then I can't leave home. The baby needs a father." I shook my head, my resolve stronger than ever. "This child doesn't need a father like you, Jake. We'll be fine without you." Sarah nodded in agreement. "You heard her, Jake. It's time for you to go. We'll have the locks changed in the morning." Jake looked from Sarah to me, realization dawning that he had lost this battle. Without another word, he stormed upstairs, presumably to pack his things. As the sound of his angry footsteps faded, I turned to Sarah, overwhelmed by the events of the day. She pulled me into a tight hug, and I felt the tension begin to leave my body. The months following that fateful night were a whirlwind of legal battles, emotional turmoil, and new beginnings. The divorce proceedings were messy, as expected, but with the mountain of evidence we had gathered, Jake didn't stand a chance. I sat in the courtroom, my hand resting protectively over my growing belly, as the judge delivered her verdict. Jake's numerous infidelities, coupled with his attempts to manipulate Sarah's living situation, worked heavily in my favor. The judge's stern voice echoed through the room as she awarded me a substantial compensation package. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her eyes boring into Jake, "your actions have been reprehensible. This court finds in favor of Mrs. Thompson and orders you to pay compensation for emotional distress." I watched Jake's face contort with anger and disbelief. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness for the man I thought I had married. But as I caught Sarah's supportive gaze from the gallery, I knew we had made the right decision. After the court proceedings, Sarah and I sat in her kitchen, our kitchen now, sipping tea and processing the day's events. "I've made some changes to my will," Sarah said suddenly, sliding a document across the table to me. I skimmed the paper, my eyes widening as I realized what I was reading. "Sarah, you can't. This is too much." She reached out, clasping my hand in hers. "Natalie, you and that baby are my family now. Jake, he made his choices. I've disinherited him. The house, my savings, they're yours and my grandson's now." As my due date approached, Sarah and I spent our evenings preparing the nursery. One night, as we folded tiny onesies and arranged stuffed animals, Sarah turned to me with a serious expression. "Natalie," she said, her voice soft but determined, "I want you to know that we're going to raise this boy right. He's going to grow up to be a man who respects women, who understands the value of loyalty and honesty." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. "You're right. He won't have his father around, but maybe that's for the best. He won't have to see that negative example." Sarah's eyes misted over. "I made mistakes with Jake. I let him see his father's behavior and didn't do enough to counteract it. But this time it'll be different. This little boy will grow up surrounded by strong women who won't tolerate disrespect or infidelity." My name is Nina, and I never thought I'd be telling this story. I grew up in a world of privilege, the only child of Robert and Elizabeth Collins. My father was a self-made man, having built his business empire from the ground up. He was stern but loving, always pushing me to be my best. My mother, on the other hand, was the epitome of grace and sophistication, moving through high society circles with ease. Our family lived in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city. I had everything a girl could want: the best education, designer clothes, exotic vacations. But despite all the material comforts, there was always a part of me that felt empty. Enter Mark Johnson. I met him during my final year of college, and it was like a bolt of lightning struck me. He was charming, handsome, and seemed to understand me in a way no one else ever had. We started dating, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly alive. There was just one problem: my parents hated him. "Nina, darling," my mother said one evening over dinner, "don't you think Mark is attracted to you not only by your inner qualities, but also by our money?" My father chimed in, his face set in a hard frown. "He's got no prospects, no ambition. He's not the kind of man who can give you the life you're accustomed to." "I don't care about any of that," I shouted, pushing away from the table. "I love him, and he loves me. Isn't that what matters?" Things came to a head when Mark proposed. It was a simple affair, no fancy restaurant, no elaborate setup. Just the two of us, walking in the park where we had our first date. He got down on one knee, pulled out a modest ring, and asked me to be his wife. I said yes without hesitation. When I told my parents, all hell broke loose. "If you marry him, you're no longer welcome in this house," my father roared. "Daddy, please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Can't you just be happy for me?" But he wouldn't budge. My mother stood silently by his side, her face a mask of disappointment. I left that night, my heart breaking but my resolve firm. I moved in with Mark, into the small apartment he shared with a roommate. It was a far cry from the luxury I was used to, but I was determined to make it work. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of planning and stress. I kept hoping my parents would come around, that they'd realize how much their presence meant to me. But as the big day approached, it became clear they weren't going to change their minds. As I walked down the aisle, I scanned the faces of our guests, still holding out hope that I'd see my parents. But they weren't there. For a moment, sadness threatened to overwhelm me. Then I saw Mark, standing at the altar, looking at me like I was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. In that moment, everything else faded away. My parents' absence, the modest surroundings, the uncertain future, none of it mattered. I was marrying the man I loved, and that was enough. After the wedding, Mark and I moved into the luxury apartment in the city center that my beloved grandfather had left me. It was a stark contrast to Mark's old place, spacious, with high ceilings, and a view of the city skyline. I spent days decorating it, trying to make it feel like our home. As the days turned into weeks and then months, we settled into married life. Mark threw himself into his work at a local marketing firm, often coming home late but always with a smile and a kiss for me. I busied myself with setting up our home and volunteering at a local animal shelter. About a year and a half after our wedding, our lives changed forever. I still remember the day I found out I was pregnant. My hands were shaking as I held the positive test, a mix of excitement and terror coursing through me. When I told Mark, his face lit up like a Christmas tree. "We're going to be parents," he exclaimed, picking me up and spinning me around. "Nina, this is amazing." When our son, Jacob, was born, I was overwhelmed with love. He was perfect, 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and a shock of dark hair, just like his father's. Through the haze of exhaustion and joy, I snapped a picture of him and sent it to my parents. I waited for a response. A call, a text, anything. But there was nothing but silence. "They'll come around," Mark assured me, seeing the hurt in my eyes. How could they resist this little guy? I tried to push the disappointment aside and focus on our new family. A few months after Jacob was born, I decided it was time for me to get back to work. I found a part-time position as a manager at a local boutique. Balancing work, a newborn, and keeping the house in order was a challenge, but I was determined to make it work. I'd wake up early to feed Jacob, drop him off at daycare, work my shift, pick him up, make dinner, clean the house, and collapse into bed, only to do it all over again the next day. But as Jacob neared his first birthday, I started to notice changes in Mark. He became more distant, often coming home even later than before. When he was home, he seemed distracted, always on his phone. "Everything okay at work?" I asked one night as we got ready for bed. "Yeah, just busy," he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. "Big project coming up." As I drifted off to sleep that night, Jacob's soft breathing coming through the baby monitor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I pushed it aside. We were happy, weren't we? We had a beautiful son, a lovely home, good jobs. What more could I want? The changes in Mark became more pronounced as time went on. One evening, as I was putting Jacob to bed, Mark cornered me in the nursery. "Nina, we need to talk," he said, his tone unusually serious. "I think you should quit your job." I blinked, sure I had misheard him. "Quit my job? Why?" "Look around," he gestured vaguely. "The house is a mess. Jacob needs more attention. I think it would be better if you focused on being a full-time mom and housewife." I felt like I'd been slapped. But I love my job. And I thought we were managing just fine. Mark's face hardened. "Well, we're not. I'm the man of this house, and I'm telling you, it's time to quit." We argued late into the night, but in the end, I gave in. I told myself it was for the good of our family, that Mark was just stressed from work. The next day, with a heavy heart, I handed in my resignation. At first, I threw myself into my new role with gusto. I deep cleaned the apartment, tried new recipes, and spent hours playing with Jacob. But as the days wore on, I found myself missing the structure and satisfaction of my job. Meanwhile, Mark's behavior continued to change. He started coming home later and later, often smelling of alcohol. Our bank account, which I had access to, showed mysterious withdrawals. One night, as I was folding laundry, I confronted him. "Mark, where is all our money going? We're barely making ends meet." He exploded. "Maybe if you knew how to budget properly, we wouldn't have this problem." I recoiled, shocked at his outburst. This wasn't the man I married. Things only got worse from there. Mark began criticizing everything I did. The house was never clean enough, dinner was never good enough, I wasn't attentive enough to Jacob. The final straw came when Jacob got sick with a nasty flu. He was running a high fever and crying constantly. I was at my wit's end, having been up for 2 nights straight. "Mark, please," I begged. "Can you take a day off work to help me with Jacob? I'm exhausted." He looked at me like I was crazy. "Take a day off? Are you kidding? Some of us actually have to work for a living, Nina." The next day, he came home with a suitcase. "I'm going to a hotel for a few days," he announced. "I need to rest after work, not listen to a screaming kid." I was stunned. "You're leaving us? Now?" He shrugged, already heading for the door. "Taking care of Jacob is your job, not mine. Call me when he's better." As the door slammed behind him, I sank to the floor, Jacob wailing in my arms. What had happened to us? To the man who had once looked at me like I hung the moon? In that moment, I missed my parents more than ever. I wanted to call them, to hear my mother's soothing voice, to feel my father's protective embrace. But pride and shame held me back. How could I admit that they had been right all along? As I rocked Jacob, trying to soothe both his cries and my own, I couldn't help but think about the words my father had said on the day I told them about my engagement. "He's not the man you think he is, Nina." The days following Mark's departure to the hotel were a blur of sleepless nights and exhausting days. Jacob's fever finally broke, and as his health improved, I found myself with more time to think, perhaps too much time. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong in my marriage. The man who had returned from the hotel was not the Mark I had fallen in love with. He was distant, irritable, and seemed to resent both Jacob and me. One evening, about a week after he'd returned, Mark came home earlier than usual. His face was serious, and he was clutching some papers. "Nina, we need to talk about insurance," he said, sitting down at the kitchen table. "I've taken out a life insurance policy on myself for $1 million. I think you should do the same." The amount made my head spin. $1 million? Mark, that seems excessive. And why do I need such a large policy? I don't even work outside the home anymore. His eyes hardened. "It's for Jacob's future. In case anything happens to either of us. Don't you want to make sure he's taken care of?" Put that way, I couldn't argue. Still, something about the whole situation felt off. "I suppose you're right," I said slowly. "If you think it's best." He nodded, seemingly satisfied. "I'll set up the appointment with the insurance agent." Over the next few days, I noticed Mark's behavior becoming even stranger. He was constantly on his phone, texting at all hours. Whenever it rang, he'd leave the room to answer, often locking himself in our home office. One morning, after Mark left for work, I made a decision. I couldn't live with this uncertainty anymore. I needed answers. With shaking hands, I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd found online. "Hawkeye Private Investigations, how can I help you?" a gruff voice answered. I took a deep breath. I need someone to follow my husband. I think he might be. I couldn't bring myself to say the words, but the investigators seemed to understand. "I see, ma'am. Why don't you come into our office and we can discuss the details?" That afternoon, while Jacob was napping, I met with the investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Linda. I told her everything, the late nights, the secret of phone calls, the drastic personality change. Linda listened intently, taking notes. "We'll get to the bottom of this, Mrs. Johnson. I'll have my best guy on it." As I left her office, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Part of me hoped this was all a misunderstanding, that there was a reasonable explanation for Mark's behavior. But a larger part knew that whatever the investigator uncovered was likely to change my life forever. 3 weeks after hiring the private investigator, I received the call I had been both dreading and anticipating. "Mrs. Johnson, we have the report ready," Linda's voice came through the phone. "You might want to sit down for this." With trembling hands, I sank into a chair, my heart pounding. "I'm ready. Tell me everything." As Linda spoke, I felt my world crumbling around me. Mark, my husband, the father of my child, had been unfaithful. He had a mistress. The evidence was irrefutable: photographs, text messages, hotel receipts. It was all there in black and white. I waited until Mark left for work the next morning before springing into action. With shaking hands, I packed a bag for myself and Jacob, throwing in only the essentials. Clothes, diapers, a few of Jacob's favorite toys. I couldn't bear to look at the photos on the walls, the happy memories that now felt like lies. "We're going to see Grandma and Grandpa," I cooed to Jacob as I put him in the stroller. He giggled, oblivious to the turmoil around him. I decided to take the metro to my parents' house. It would be faster than driving through rush hour traffic. As I approached the station, my mind was racing, planning our next steps. That's when it happened. I was crossing the street, pushing Jacob in his stroller, when suddenly there was a screech of tires. I turned my head and saw a car hurtling towards us. In a split second, I pushed the stroller out of the way. Then, pain. Blinding, all-consuming pain. And then, darkness. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I finally opened my eyes, I was in a hospital room. The steady beep of machines filled the air. And there, sitting by my bed, looking haggard and worried, was Mark. "Jacob," I croaked, my throat dry. "Where's Jacob?" Mark leaned forward, taking my hand. "He's fine, Nina. He's with Lisa, your best friend. Not a scratch on him." Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by a wave of pain. I looked down at my legs, both encased in casts. "You have multiple fractures in both legs," Mark explained gently. "The doctors say it'll take about a year for you to fully recover. You'll need to use a wheelchair for a while." I closed my eyes, trying to process this information. A year. A wheelchair. And then, like a bolt of lightning, I remembered why I had been at that metro station in the first place. "I know about her," I blurted out, my eyes snapping open to gauge Mark's reaction. "Your mistress." "I know everything." Mark's face paled. For a moment, he looked like he might deny it. Then his shoulders slumped. "Nina, it wasn't serious. It was a stupid mistake," he stammered. "When I got the call about your accident, I realized how close I came to losing you." "I can't lose you, Nina. Please, can we start over? Give me another chance. I'll do better, I promise." I looked at him, this man I had loved for so long. He seemed so sincere, so remorseful. And I was so tired, so overwhelmed by everything that had happened. "Okay," I heard myself say. "We can try." The day I was discharged from the hospital was surreal. Mark arrived with a bouquet of my favorite flowers, pink peonies. His smile seemed genuine, his eyes filled with concern and love. As he wheeled me out of the hospital, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could make this work after all. The first 2 weeks at home were surprisingly nice. Mark was attentive, caring, almost doting. He helped me with everything, from getting dressed to bathing. He'd carry me to the bathroom in his arms, careful not to jostle my injured legs. It reminded me of our early days together, when every touch felt electric. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Mark turned to me with a glint in his eye. "Nina, I've been thinking," he said, taking my hand. "We should get away for a weekend. Just the two of us. To celebrate your recovery and, well, us." My heart skipped a beat. "Really? Where?" "I found this cozy little house in the mountains, overlooking a beautiful canyon." "What do you say?" I couldn't help but smile. That sounds wonderful. But what about Jacob? And I'm in a wheelchair. I'm sure Lisa wouldn't mind watching him for a couple of days. About the wheelchair. If anything, I'll carry you in my arms. Come on, it'll be good for us. I agreed, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This could be exactly what we needed to reconnect. The drive to the mountains was peaceful. As we wound our way up the narrow road, I felt the tension of the past months slowly melting away. The house, when we arrived, was everything Mark had promised: cozy, secluded, with breathtaking views of the canyon. I'm going to explore a bit, Mark said after we'd settled in. Why don't you rest? I nodded, watching him disappear down a trail. Left alone, I decided to check my emails. I hadn't had a chance to do so since the accident. My phone was nowhere to be found, so I wheeled myself over to Mark's laptop. As I opened the browser, an email notification popped up. It was from an unfamiliar address, but the subject line made my blood run cold. Urgent, new information about your case. With trembling hands, I clicked on it. The message was from Linda, the private investigator I'd hired weeks ago. My heart pounded as I read. Mrs. Johnson, I've been trying to reach you. Your number is out of service. I've uncovered disturbing new information. You're in danger. Your husband was involved in your accident. He's trying to get rid of you for the insurance money and your apartment. His mistress was driving the car that hit you. I've attached evidence, photos, videos, texts. Please contact me immediately. I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. There was Mark, plotting with his mistress. There were bank statements showing large withdrawals. There was a grainy video of a woman who looked remarkably like Mark's assistant behind the wheel of a car, moments before impact. Just as I closed the laptop, Mark walked in. I tried to compose myself, but my heart was racing. Everything okay, Nina? He asked, his voice deceptively casual. I forced a smile. Yeah, I can't find my phone. Have you seen it? A cold smile played on Mark's lips. Oh, that. It broke down suddenly. Must have been damaged in the accident. A chill ran down my spine. I needed to contact someone, anyone, but how? Mark, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Could I borrow your phone? I want to check on Jacob, see how he's doing with Lisa. He hesitated for a moment, then handed me his phone. Sure, go ahead. I'll just be right here. My hands trembled as I took the phone. Mark hovered nearby, watching. I knew I couldn't call the police or even Lisa. Then, a memory flashed in my mind, a conversation with my father years ago. If you're ever in trouble and can't speak freely, ask about Buddy the bear. I'll know you need help. Praying my father hadn't changed his number, I dialed. When he answered, I put on my brightest voice. Hey, Lisa, how's everything going? How's Buddy the bear doing? There was a pause, and I held my breath. Then my father's voice came through, deliberately high-pitched to sound feminine. Oh, you know, same old, same old. How are you? Relief washed over me. He understood. Oh, it's lovely up here, I gushed, aware of Mark's eyes on me. We're at this beautiful cabin, 1247 Pine Ridge Road. The view of Evergreen Canyon is just stunning. I see, my father said carefully. When do you think you'll be back? Oh, I dream of seeing you right now, this very second. I said emphatically. I miss you guys already. After exchanging a few more pleasantries, I hung up. Mark seemed satisfied, not suspecting anything amiss. As evening approached, Mark suggested a walk. The sunset over the canyon is beautiful. We shouldn't miss it. Fear gripped me, but I knew I had no choice. That sounds nice, I managed to say. Mark wheeled me out onto a narrow path that wound along the edge of the canyon. The view was breathtaking, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, the canyon stretching endlessly before us, but all I could think about was the sheer drop just feet away. As Mark pushed my wheelchair, chatting about the scenery as if everything was normal, I closed my eyes and prayed. "Please, Dad," I thought desperately. "Please find me in time." The path curved one last time, and suddenly we were at the edge of the cliff. Mark turned my chair around, and our eyes met. The loving facade he'd maintained crumbled away, revealing a stranger with eyes full of anger and hatred. "You know, Nina," he said, his voice cold and detached, "I'm really sorry it had to come to this. The car accident was supposed to take care of everything, but you just had to survive, didn't you?" My blood ran cold as the full truth of my situation hit me. "Mark, please," I whispered, "don't do this." He laughed mirthlessly. "Do you have any idea how perfect this is? A tragic accident at a scenic overlook. Your wheelchair rolls off the edge when the brakes fail. I'll be the grieving widower, inherit your apartment, and cash in that $1 million insurance policy. It's foolproof." As he spoke, he inched my wheelchair closer to the edge. I closed my eyes, silently praying for a miracle. Suddenly, I heard shouts and running footsteps. My eyes flew open to see my father sprinting down the path, followed closely by several police officers. "Nina," my father yelled, reaching us just as Mark was about to push me over. He grabbed the handles of my wheelchair, yanking me back from the brink. Everything happened in a blur after that. The police tackled Mark to the ground, reading him his rights as they handcuffed him. I sat there, shaking, as the reality of what had almost happened washed over me. My father knelt beside my wheelchair, pulling me into a tight embrace. I broke down, sobbing into his shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Dad," I choked out between sobs. "You were right about him. I should have listened to you." He stroked my hair gently, his own voice thick with emotion. "No, sweetheart. I'm the one who should be sorry. We let our pride keep us apart. Can you forgive us for not being there for you and Jacob?" I nodded, unable to speak through my tears. We stayed like that for a long moment, years of hurt and misunderstanding melting away. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. I filed for divorce, and with the overwhelming evidence against him, Mark was sentenced to prison for attempted murder, along with his mistress who had driven the car in the original accident. I sold the apartment that held so many painful memories and bought a new one, close to a good school for Jacob and just a few blocks from my parents' house. I moved back in with my parents during my rehabilitation. It was a year of healing, both physically and emotionally. My parents doted on Jacob, making up for lost time with their grandson. Slowly, I learned to trust again, to smile again, to hope again.